Imagine a world where hitting the snooze button doesn't exist because your alarm clock is the freezing air biting at your face and the crackle of a dying hearth. In the 1800s, luxury wasn't a smartphone or a fast car. It was a dry pair of socks and a fire that stayed lit through the night. You aren't just waking up to start your day, you're waking up to survive it. From the moment your feet hit the cold floorboards to the second you blow out the tallow candle at night, every hour is a battle of grit, muscle, and tradition. This is what it was actually like to live 24 hours in the 19th century. The day does not begin with the sun. It begins in the suffocating darkness of a room that is often the same temperature as the world outside. For a family in 1800s America, the transition from sleep to action is abrupt and shivering. There is no thermostat to turn up. Instead, the first person awake, usually the mother or the eldest son, must face the most critical task of the day, reviving the fire. If the embers died out overnight, they face a tedious struggle with flint and steel or a precious, expensive match. A house without a fire is a house without a pulse. By 5 a.m., the kitchen is the center of the universe. While the hearth begins to roar, the men head out to the barn. In an era where 90% of the population is tied to agriculture, the livestock are the family's lifeblood. In the biting cold, they milk cows by hand, the steam rising from the pails in the dim lantern light. They muck out stalls and feed the horses that will later pull the plows or the wagons. There is no mechanical assistance. Every gallon of water for the animals must be pumped by hand and carried in heavy wooden buckets. The physical strain begins before the sun has even cleared the horizon. Inside the house, the morning routine is a far cry from modern hygiene. There is no running water. If you want to wash your face, you pour lukewarm water from a ceramic pitcher into a basin. Most people skip the full body scrub, opting instead for a quick splash. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and frying salt pork. Breakfast is not a light affair of cereal or toast. It is a high-calorie fuel mission. Cornmeal mush, heavy biscuits, eggs, and perhaps some preserved meat are served. You need these calories because the next 6 hours will demand more physical exertion than most modern people experience in a week. By 7 a.m., the second morning begins. The children, if they aren't needed for heavy field work, prepare for a long walk to a one-room schoolhouse, often miles away. They carry tin pails filled with simple lunches, perhaps a cold biscuit and an apple. Meanwhile, the women transition from cooking to the heavy housework. In the 1800s, chores are not daily, they are seasonal and grueling. If it's a Monday, it's wash day, a terrifyingly labor-intensive process of hauling dozens of gallons of water, boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing clothes against a corrugated board until knuckles bleed. As the sun finally sits high enough to burn off the morning mist, the true weight of the day settles in. The silence of the countryside is broken only by the rhythmic thud of an axe or the lowing of cattle. There is no background noise, no humming refrigerators, no distant traffic. There is only the work, and the knowledge that if the work stops, the family doesn't eat. The 19th century morning is a testament to human endurance, a ritual of fire and frost that sets the stage for a day of relentless toil. By mid-morning, the deceptive calm of the early dawn has vanished, replaced by the relentless grind of 19th century labor. For the American man in the 1800s, this is the window where the back-breaking nature of life becomes literal. If it is spring, he's behind a plow, pulled by oxen or horses, his hands gripped tight around wooden handles that vibrate with every rock and root struck in the soil. There is no suspension, no padded seat, just the jarring impact of the earth against human bone. If it is summer, he's swinging a scythe in the hayfields. This is a rhythmic, hypnotic, yet exhausting motion that requires every muscle in the core and shoulders. A momentary lapse in concentration doesn't just mean a ruined crop, it means a blade through a limb in a world where surgery is a terrifying last resort. Meanwhile, the household has become a factory of domestic production. To a modern observer, the 19th century woman might look like a homemaker, but in reality she's a chemist, a seamstress, and a food processor.
By 9 a.m., the kitchen is sweltering. Even in the heat of a humid July, the wood-burning stove must remain lit. She's likely baking bread, a task that requires kneading heavy dough by hand for 20 minutes at a time. Without chemical leavening or pre-packaged yeast, she relies on starters that must be kept alive like a pet. But the work extends far beyond the kitchen. She moves to the garden, which is not a hobby, but a survival plot. She hoes weeds under the scorching sun to ensure the winter stores of potatoes, beans, and squash will be sufficient. If a garment tore the day before, she isn't buying a replacement. She's sitting for a rare, quiet moment to mend it by hand with a needle and thread, her eyes straining in the sunlight. Every scrap of fabric is a resource. Nothing is disposable. The concept of trash barely exists because everything is repurposed, repaired, or burned for fuel. Around noon, the dinner bell rings. In the 1800s, dinner is the largest meal of the day, served at midday to provide the energy needed for the remaining 8 hours of light. This isn't a quick sandwich eaten over a keyboard. The men return from the fields, their shirts soaked through with sweat and stained with the salt of their own bodies. They wash their hands and faces in a communal basin outside the door, shaking off the dust of the trail. The meal is heavy and silent. There is little small talk. Eating is a functional necessity. They consume bowls of stew, thick slices of salt-cured pork, and heavy dumplings. The room is thick with heat and the buzzing of flies, as window screens are a luxury many rural homes still lack. To keep the insects off the food, younger children might be tasked with waving a fly fan made of braided straw or feathers over the table. As the meal ends, there is no afternoon slump or nap. The men may take 10 minutes to sharpen their tools on a whetstone, the rhythmic shick-shick of steel on stone marking the countdown back to labor. The sun is now at its zenith, beating down on the dust-choked roads and the shimmering fields. The hardest part of the day isn't over, it's only half done. The psychological weight of the 19th century begins to settle in now, the realization that tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after, the cycle will repeat with the same brutal intensity.
The afternoon in the 1800s is where the physical toll of the day begins to manifest as a dull, throbbing ache in the joints. For the men and older boys, the hours between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. are the drudge hours. If they aren't in the fields, they're mending fences, heavy timber rails that must be lifted and notched into place, or perhaps digging a new well. Every hole dug is a battle against clay and rock, executed with nothing but a hand-forged shovel and sheer adrenaline. The sun, moving toward the west, offers no respite. It only changes the angle of the glare hitting their eyes. For the women, the afternoon is often dedicated to specialty tasks that vary by the day of the week. This might be the time for candle making or soap making. Soap making is a visceral, dangerous process involving lye, leached from wood ashes, and rendered animal fat saved from previous slaughters. The mixture boils in a massive iron pot over an outdoor fire, emitting a pungent, heavy odor that clings to the hair and clothes. One splash of the caustic lye on the skin causes a chemical burn, yet this is a routine part of maintaining a clean household. There is no store to run to for a bar of Dove. If you don't make it, your family doesn't wash. By 4 p.m., a subtle shift occurs. The light turns golden, stretching the shadows of the oaks and maples across the dirt yards. This isn't a sign to relax, but a signal for the evening chores. This is the second peak of activity. The livestock, which had been grazing or working, must be brought back in. Water must be hauled again, gallons upon gallons for the kitchen, the cleaning, and the animals. A typical 19th century housewife might carry several hundred pounds of water in a single day, her posture permanently altered by the weight of the yokes across her shoulders. In town, for those not on farms, the afternoon is spent in cramped, dim workshops or general stores. A blacksmith's apprentice spends these hours pumping bellows, his face blackened by soot and his lungs breathing in the fine dust of coal and iron. There is no air conditioning. The heat of the forge, combined with the summer humidity, creates a stifling environment that makes breathing feel like swallowing warm wool. For the shopkeeper, The afternoon is a constant stream of bartering. Money is scarce, so he spends his time weighing out butter, eggs, or handmade nails in exchange for cloth or sugar. Every transaction is a negotiation of survival. As 5:30 p.m. approaches, the children return from school. Their free time is non-existent. They are immediately pressed into service, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, being careful of the protective hens, or picking the hornworms off the tobacco and tomato plants. The younger children are sent to the wood's edge to gather kindling, small sticks, and fallen branches to ensure the fire can be fed for the evening meal. The fatigue by 6 p.m. is a heavy shroud. The human body is pushed to its absolute limit, yet the final transition of the day is just beginning. The hunger returns, but it's a tired hunger. As the sun dips below the horizon, the world plunges into a type of darkness modern humans can barely comprehend. Without the glow of streetlights or the hum of a distant city, the coming of night feels like a physical curtain being drawn, forcing the family back toward the flickering safety of the hearth. As the sun vanishes, the 19th century world undergoes a terrifying transformation. Today, we flick a switch and banish the night, but in the 1800s, darkness is an entity you have to fight. The supper hour is a subdued bookend to the day. Unlike the heavy midday dinner, supper is often lighter, perhaps leftovers, a bowl of cornmeal mush, or bread and milk. The family huddles around a single table, illuminated not by overhead lights, but by the orange dancing glow of a tallow candle or a primitive whale oil lamp. The light is poor, so poor that it causes constant eye strain. If you've ever tried to read a book by the light of a single birthday candle, you understand the dimness of a 19th century home. This twilight period is when the family finally sits, but sitting does not mean relaxing. Idleness is seen as a moral failing. The father might use the dim light to repair a leather harness or carve a new tool handle from hickory. The mother's hands are never still. She spins wool into yarn using a spinning wheel that hums a rhythmic, ghostly tune, or she continues the endless task of knitting socks. In the 1800s, if you don't knit your family's socks, their feet freeze in the winter. Socializing is intimate and vocal. Without the distraction of screens, the family talks. They share stories, recite verses from the Bible, or discuss the rumors heard at the general store. If the family is musical, someone might pull out a fiddle or a jaw harp. Music isn't something you listen to, it's something you make. This is the glue of 19th century society, the shared experience of the hearth. However, the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of the day's toll, the smell of drying wood, the faint metallic tang of the lamps, and the earthy musk of bodies that haven't seen a bath in a week. Hygiene at night is a chore in itself. A full bath requires hauling more water and heating it on the stove, a process so grueling that most save it for Saturday nights. On a typical weeknight, it's a dry wash or a quick scrub of the hands and face. As 8 p.m. approaches, the night air, once feared to carry diseases, begins to cool the house. The final task of the evening is banking the fire. This is a survival skill, covering the glowing coals with ash so they stay hot enough to be revived in the morning, but won't burn through the wood too quickly. If the fire goes out, the morning starts in a desperate, freezing race. One by one, the candles are blown out. The transition from light to total darkness is instantaneous and jarring. There is no blue light from a phone to ease the eyes into sleep. There is only the absolute oppressive blackness of the rural night, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the wind rattling the window panes. By 9 p.m., the house is silent. The physical exhaustion is so deep that sleep comes quickly, despite the beds often being stuffed with rustling corn husks or itchy straw. The family sleeps in layers, huddled together for warmth, knowing that in just 7 short hours, the freezing floorboards and the dying embers will demand they do it all over again. The day is done not because the work is finished, but because the human body and the candle have both finally burned out. While the daily clock governed the hours,
The seasons governed the very soul of the 1800s. A Tuesday in July looked nothing like a Tuesday in January. In the 19th century, humans didn't dominate nature, they negotiated with it. Your survival depended entirely on your ability to read the sky and the soil, pivoting your entire existence as the earth tilted. Winter was the season of the slow grind. When the ground froze solid, the frantic pace of the fields stopped, but a new kind of dread set in, the fear of the depletion of resources. The day was shorter, meaning more money spent on precious candles and oil. Men spent their daylight hours in the woodlot, felling massive oaks and maples. This wasn't just a chore, it was a race. A single hearth could swallow 20 cords of wood in a season. If you ran out of dry wood in February, you were essentially inviting death into your home. Inside, women turned the house into a textile mill, weaving, spinning, and sewing the heavy woolens needed to keep the family from frostbite. The diet turned monotonous: salted meats, dried beans, and root vegetables from the cellar that grew soft and sprouted as the months dragged on. Then came the quickening of spring. As the thaws arrived, the mud became an adversary. Roads turned into quagmires of waist-deep sludge, isolating families for weeks. But the work was explosive. This was the time for sugar-off in the northern states, collecting maple sap in a grueling 24-hour cycle of boiling. It was the time for calving and lambing, where farmers spent nights in freezing barns to ensure the next generation of the herd survived. The transition from the indoor life of winter to the outdoor life of spring was a shock to the system, often accompanied by spring fever, not a romantic notion, but a literal physical depletion from a lack of fresh greens and vitamin C. Summer was the season of the Great Sweat. It was the most physically demanding time of the year. In the 1800s, there was no escaping the humidity of the American South, or the blistering sun of the Midwest. The workday stretched to 16 hours. Haying season was the peak. It was a communal effort where neighbors joined forces to beat the rain. If the hay got wet, it would rot, and the livestock would starve in the winter. Men worked until they fainted from heat stroke, and women hauled massive field meals out to the workers, their own faces scorched by the heat of the outdoor cook stoves. Finally, the harvest, the high-stakes gamble of autumn. This was the most stressful month of the year. One early frost or one hailstorm could wipe out an entire year's worth of labor. The family worked in a frenzy, picking, husking, threshing, and preserving. The putting up of food was a desperate marathon. Thousands of pounds of produce had to be pickled, dried, or stored in sand-filled pits. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and ripening apples. By the time the first snow flurries appeared, the 19th century family was physically broken, but spiritually relieved. They had filled the larder. They had survived the cycle once more. The 1800s weren't just about a single day. They were about the relentless endurance of the seasons. There was no weekend and no vacation. There was only the movement of the sun and the shifting of the wind, a life lived in perfect, brutal harmony with the world as it was. In the 1800s, a simple scratch or a sudden fever wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. To understand the 19th century mindset, you have to realize that they lived in a world without germ theory. People believed miasma, or bad air, caused disease. The transition from a productive workday to a fight for survival could happen in an afternoon. If a father stepped on a rusted nail or a child developed a persistent cough, the entire household was gripped by a specific, chilling kind of dread. The family doctor was often miles away, and calling him was a luxury few could afford. Even when he arrived, his bag of tricks was terrifying by modern standards. Medicine in the 1800s was a strange cocktail of ancient folklore and brutal trial and error.
Doctors might prescribe bloodletting, the practice of draining a patient's blood to balance the humors, or apply leeches to a swollen limb. For a person already weakened by a day of hard labor, these treatments were often more dangerous than the illness itself. Because professional help was scarce, the burden of health care fell on the mother. Every farmhouse had a physic garden and a shelf of home remedies. If you had a chest cold, she might strap a mustard plaster to your skin, a paste of mustard powder and flour that would literally blister the flesh to draw out the sickness. For pain, there was often nothing but laudanum, a potent mix of opium and alcohol, or a stiff pull of corn whiskey. Dental care was even more primitive. If a tooth rotted, it was yanked out with a pair of pliers by the local blacksmith or a traveling dentist, usually without a drop of anesthesia. Public health was a constant gamble. In the growing American cities, the 1800s were defined by massive outbreaks of cholera, yellow fever, and smallpox. Without indoor plumbing, waste often ended up in the same water sources used for drinking. A single contaminated well could wipe out half a neighborhood in a week. There was no social distancing or sanitation as we know it. People lived in close quarters, sharing beds and towels, unknowingly passing invisible killers from hand to hand. Death was not a hidden event behind hospital walls. It happened at home. When a family member passed away, the rituals were intimate and visceral. The body was washed and dressed by the family, and the wake was held in the parlor, the best room in the house. This constant proximity to mortality created a culture that was deeply spiritual and surprisingly resilient. They didn't have the luxury of denial. By the time the lamp was lit at night, the silence of the house was often heavy with the absence of those who hadn't survived the previous winter. Every day spent in good health was seen as a divine gift, not a guarantee. This fragility of life is why the work was so urgent. They weren't just building a farm or a business, they were racing against the clock of their own mortality.
While the farm was a kingdom of isolation, the town was the nervous system of the 1800s. For a rural family, a trip to the nearest settlement wasn't a casual errand. It was a major expedition, often planned weeks in advance. Setting out at 4 a.m. in a wagon, the jolting journey over corduroy roads, paths made of logs laid side by side, could take hours. But as the steeple of the local church or the smoke from the grist mill came into view, the isolation of the wilderness finally broke. The heart of every 19th century American town was the general store. Walking through its heavy oak doors was a sensory explosion. It smelled of a chaotic blend of coffee beans, cured tobacco, salted fish, kerosene, and bolts of unwashed calico. This wasn't just a place of business, it was the social media of the era. Near the potbelly stove in the center of the room, men sat on overturned crates, chewing tobacco and debating politics or crop prices. Here, news traveled by word of mouth, a neighbor's barn fire, a wedding in the next county, or the escalating tensions leading toward a distant war. For the women, the general store was a rare window into a world of luxury. They would run their fingers over fine silks or examine porcelain dishes imported from Europe, though they likely only walked away with the essentials, a bag of sugar, a tin of saleratus, baking soda, or a specific gauge of sewing thread. Commerce was rarely conducted with cash. Instead, it was a complex dance of barter and credit. A farmer's wife would bring in a basket of eggs or hand-churned butter, and the storekeeper would carefully weigh them, marking the value against the family's running debt. Beyond the store, the town was a hive of specialized muscle. You could hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the loom from the textile mill, or the deafening roar of the water-powered sawmill. The blacksmith was the most vital man in the community. His forge was a place of sparks and sweat, where he didn't just fix tools, he created the very hardware of civilization, from horseshoe nails to hinges.
The social hierarchy was visible in every interaction. The local lawyer or doctor, dressed in a slightly cleaner wool coat, moved with an air of authority, while the hired hands and laborers worked the docks or the warehouses with stained hands and stooped backs. Yet, despite the grime and the labor, there was a profound sense of belonging. In the 1800s, your reputation was your currency. Everyone knew your father, your debts, and your work ethic. As the sun began to dip, the wagons were loaded with supplies, and the families began the long, dark trek back to their homesteads. They left the noise of the town behind, but they carried with them the stories and news that would be dissected and retold around the hearth for the next month. The town was a reminder that they weren't just individuals struggling against nature. They were part of a growing, heaving nation that was being built one horseshoe and one barter at a time. In a world of relentless, bone-breaking toil, there was only one day that stood still: Sunday. In the 1800s, the Sabbath was not just a religious obligation, it was a societal law. For 6 days, the human body was a machine, but on the seventh, it was required to be a soul. To a modern observer, a 19th century Sunday might seem restrictive, but to the laborer of 1840, it was the only thing keeping them from a total physical collapse. The transition began on Saturday night. The Saturday night bath was a ritual of purification. Using the same large galvanized tub, the family would take turns scrubbing away a week's worth of field dust and engine grease, starting with the father and ending with the youngest child. The water grew cold and gray, but by the end they were clean for the Lord. Clothes that had been painstakingly washed and pressed earlier in the week, the Sunday best, were laid out. These were often the only garments the family owned that weren't patched or stained. Sunday morning brought a strange, heavy silence to the landscape. The rhythmic thud of the axe and the shouting of teamsters vanished. The family piled into the wagon, traveling perhaps 5 or 10 miles to the local church. The church was the literal and figurative center of the community. It was the only place where the isolated farm wife could speak to another woman, and where the lonely frontiersman could feel part of a tribe. The service itself was an endurance test. In an era before short attention spans, a sermon could last 3 hours. The pews were hard, unpadded wood, designed to keep you awake and attentive to the preacher's warnings of fire and brimstone. There was no heating in the winter, save for small foot stoves filled with hot coals brought from home. Yet people listened with an intensity we now reserve for blockbuster movies. This was their education, their philosophy, and their news. After the service, the social hour took place in the churchyard. This was the only time for courtship. Young men, their hair slicked down with hog lard or bear grease, would attempt to catch the eye of a girl under the watchful gaze of her father. Business deals were quietly whispered, and sick neighbors were checked on. The rest of the Sunday was spent in holy idleness. No heavy work was permitted. You didn't plow, you didn't sew, and in some strict households you didn't even whistle. The afternoon was spent reading the Bible, or perhaps a Pilgrim's Progress by the window. For the children, this was often the hardest part of the week, forced to sit still when their bodies were used to constant motion. As the sun set on Sunday, a specific kind of melancholy settled over the household. The great rest was ending. The Sunday best were folded back into cedar chests, and the rough, sweat-stained work clothes were pulled out for the morning. The peace of the Sabbath was a thin veil, and beneath it, the gears of the 19th century work week were already beginning to grind again.
While the adults were locked in a struggle with the land, the children of the 1800s were engaged in a different kind of labor. Education wasn't a given, it was a seasonal privilege. In rural America, the school year was designed around the farm. Winter term was for the older boys who weren't needed for plowing, while the summer term was for the younger children. The setting for this intellectual awakening was the iconic one-room schoolhouse, a drafty wooden structure that served as a melting pot for ages 5 to 18. The school day began with a long trek. Some children walked 5 miles through mud, snow, or sweltering heat, carrying their lunch in a tin lard pail. Inside the school, the atmosphere was one of strict military-like discipline. There were no grades like we have today. Instead, students were grouped by their reader level. A 6-year-old learning her ABCs sat on the same backless wooden bench as a 19-year-old man struggling with long division. The curriculum was stripped down to the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But it was far from simple. Students were expected to memorize long passages of poetry and historical speeches. They didn't have paper, it was too expensive. Instead, they used small slate boards and limestone pencils. Every mistake was wiped away with a rag or a sleeve, meaning you had to hold the information in your head, not just on the page. The schoolmaster, or schoolmarm, was a figure of absolute authority. They weren't just teachers, they were the janitors and the disciplinarians. The teacher arrived an hour early to start the stove and sweep the floor. Discipline was swift and physical. If you whispered, shifted in your seat, or failed to recite your McGuffey reader perfectly, you might face the hickory stick or be forced to stand in the corner wearing a dunce cap. Education was seen as a moral forge. It was meant to break laziness and build character. Recess was the only release. In the dirt yard outside, the children played games that required nothing but imagination and energy. Tag, baseball with a stitched leather ball and a wooden stick, or fox and geese. It was a brief explosion of childhood in a life that otherwise demanded they grow up fast. By age 12, many boys would leave school forever to work the fields full time, their formal education sacrificed to the survival of the family farm. As the school bell rang at 4 p.m., the children didn't head home to play video games or do light chores. They ran back to the reality of the 18th century afternoon, milking, wood stacking, and water hauling. The schoolhouse was a brief window into a world of ideas, but the shadows were growing long, and the farm was calling them back to the grit of the present. To travel at night in the 1800s was to step into a different world, one where the familiar landscape became a treacherous maze. Today, we navigate by the constant hum of streetlights and GPS, but in the 19th century, the night watch was a period of profound vulnerability. If you were caught on the road after sunset, you weren't just traveling, you were at the mercy of the elements and the limits of human technology. The primary tool for the night traveler was the lantern. Whether it was a punched tin lantern that cast a flickering, patterned light, or a more expensive glass wick lamp, the radius of visibility was pitiful, rarely more than 6 or 5 feet. Beyond that circle of yellow light lay a wall of absolute black. For a rider on horseback or a driver of a stagecoach, the dangers were physical and immediate. A washed-out bridge, a fallen timber, or a slough, a deep mud hole, could snap a horse's leg or overturn a wagon in seconds. There were no reflectors, no road signs, and no one to call for help. Then there was the psychological weight of the unknown. In the early to mid-1800s, much of the American landscape was still wild. In the deep woods of the Ohio Valley or the shadows of the Appalachians, the night was alive with sounds that modern ears rarely hear. The bone-chilling scream of a mountain lion, or the rhythmic howling of wolves. For the solitary traveler, every rustle in the underbrush was a potential threat, either animal or human. Highwaymen and bandits were a grim reality on isolated stretches of road, knowing that a lone traveler was a soft target with no hope of a quick police response. If a traveler found themselves too far from home, they sought refuge in a wayside inn or a tavern. These were not the sterile private hotel rooms of today. You paid for a spot on a communal bed, often sleeping shoulder to shoulder with 3 or 4 complete strangers on a mattress stuffed with lumpy straw.
The air in these taverns was thick with the smell of stale ale, unwashed bodies, and the smoke from a dying hearth. It was a restless, guarded sleep. Men often slept with their boots on and their traveling pistols or knives tucked close to their chests. Even for those safe at home, the night required a watch. In larger towns, the night watchman walked the cobblestone streets, swinging a lantern and calling out the hours. 2 o'clock and all is well. His job was to look for the greatest enemy of the 19th century city, fire. In a world built of wood and lit by open flames, a single tipped candle could level a city block before the sun rose. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the tension of the night watch finally broke. The traveler emerged from the woods, the watchman ended his rounds, and the family in the farmhouse stirred to life once more. The night hadn't just been a time for sleep, it had been a gauntlet to be run. Survival meant making it through the darkness to see the sun rise on yet another day of toil.
As the 1800s progressed, a massive mechanical heartbeat began to drown out the sounds of the farm. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a change in technology, it was a total rewrite of the human experience. For thousands of years, humans had lived by God's time, the rising and setting of the sun. But as the mid-19th century arrived, people began living by factory time. This shift created a new kind of day, one dictated by the unrelenting rhythm of the steam engine and the shrill blast of the factory whistle. For the thousands of young men and women moving from rural homesteads to cities like Lowell or Pittsburgh, the change was a shock to the soul. In the factory, the seasons no longer mattered. Whether it was a blizzard outside or a heat wave, the machines never stopped. The workday was carved into precise shifts. If you were 1 minute late, your pay was docked. If you were 5 minutes late, you were locked out. This was the birth of the commute. Instead of walking 50 feet to a barn, workers trudged through smog-choked streets to massive brick buildings that hummed with a vibration that could be felt in the teeth. Inside the mills, the day was a sensory nightmare. The air was filled with fluff, tiny fibers of cotton or wool that workers inhaled for 12 hours a day, leading to the brown lung disease. The noise was deafening. Hundreds of power looms clattered so loudly that workers had to develop their own form of sign language to communicate. Unlike the varied tasks of the farm, milking, then chopping, then planting, the factory worker did one single repetitive motion thousands of times a day. This division of labor turned humans into extensions of the iron machines they tended. This era also saw the controversial rise of child labor on an industrial scale. Small children, some as young as 6 or 7, were employed as scavengers or piecers. Their tiny frames allowed them to crawl under moving machinery to clear lint or tie broken threads. They worked the same 14-hour days as the adults, often falling asleep at their stations from sheer exhaustion. The sun would rise and set while these children were trapped behind soot-stained glass, never feeling the wind or the grass. The evening freedom for a factory worker was a grim shadow of the farm's hearthside. They didn't return to a spacious farmhouse, but to tenements, cramped, dark apartments where multiple families shared a single room. There was no garden to provide fresh vegetables. Instead, they relied on company stores or city markets where food was often adulterated with chalk or sawdust to increase weight. By the late 1800s, the clock had won. The introduction of standardized time zones, driven by the expansion of the railroads, meant that for the first time in history, noon was the same in New York as it was in Boston. The local, organic flow of life was dead. The 19th century day had become a commodity, something to be sold to an employer in exchange for a wage.
Humans had gained the power of mass production, but they had lost the ancient connection to the natural world. As the year 1899 bled into 1900, the day as humans had known it for millennia was unrecognizable. If a man born in 1800 could have been transported to 1899, he would have felt like he was on another planet. In just 100 years, the human experience had undergone a more radical transformation than it had in the previous 2000. The sun was no longer the master of the world. The light bulb, the steam engine, and the telegram had conquered the limitations of nature. The most profound change was the death of the total darkness. By the late 1990s, the first electric streetlights were flickering to life in major American cities. For the first time in human history, the night was optional. The great silence of the rural evening was being replaced by the hum of electricity and the distant rumble of the locomotive. The world was shrinking. A message that once took weeks to travel across the country on horseback now moved in seconds via the telegraph wire. The isolation that defined the early 1800s, the quiet, lonely struggle of the homestead, was being replaced by a frantic, interconnected global society. But as the physical burden of the day eased, a new kind of modern stress took its place. The 1800s began with the challenge of survival, but it ended with the challenge of efficiency. The farmer of 1810 worried about the weather. The clerk of 1890 worried about the stock market, the train schedule, and the ticking of the office clock. We traded the blisters on our hands for the anxiety of the rat race. The simplicity of the 19th century day, the clear beginning and end to labor, was dissolving into a world that never truly slept. Yet, as we look back on that century of grit, we see a level of resilience that is almost alien to the modern world. Every person who lived through the 1800s was, by necessity, a master of their environment. They knew how to build, how to fix, how to heal, and how to endure. They lived a sensory life, one of sharp cold, searing heat, and the heavy scent of the earth. Their days were defined by a profound presence. When they ate, they knew exactly where the food came from. When they sat by the fire, they knew exactly whose sweat had chopped the wood. The 1800s were a bridge. We entered the century with candles and wooden plows. We exited with telephones and steel skyscrapers. It was a brutal, beautiful, and exhausting era that forged the modern world. Today, when we flip a light switch or turn a tap for hot water, we are reaping the rewards of their relentless toil. Their 24-hour struggle was the foundation upon which our 24-hour convenience was built. The sun sets on the 19th century, leaving behind a legacy of iron and bone. The wagons have stopped rattling, the hearths have cooled, and the long shadows of the 1800s have finally faded into history. But the spirit of that era, the sheer, stubborn will to survive another day, remains the most powerful story of the human experience.
While the physical work of the 1800s was brutal, the social landscape was governed by an invisible, rigid framework of rules. In the 19th century, manners weren't just about being polite. They were a survival mechanism used to maintain order in a world that often felt chaotic and dirty. For a U.S. audience, understanding these Victorian values reveals how people managed to keep their dignity while living in conditions we would consider primitive. A person's reputation or character was their most valuable asset. For a man, his word was a legal contract. For a woman, propriety was her protection. One of the biggest taboos of the era was the public display of low behavior. Even on a sweltering July day, a gentleman would never be seen in public without his coat and hat.
To show one's shirt sleeves was considered intimate, almost scandalous, like a modern person walking around in their underwear. This obsession with coverage extended to language as well. People used euphemisms for everything. One didn't speak of a chicken's leg or breast at a dinner table. They asked for dark meat or light meat to avoid mentioning body parts. The calling card was the 19th century version of a notification. If you wanted to visit a neighbor in town, you didn't just knock on the door. You left a small engraved card. If the corner was folded a certain way, it carried a specific message. This created a social buffer, allowing people to curate their interactions in a world where they were physically crowded together. Privacy was a luxury, so etiquette created mental privacy. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of 1800s social life was the language of flowers, or floriography. Because direct emotional expression was often suppressed, young lovers used bouquets to send secret messages. Sending a red rose meant, "I love you," but sending a yellow carnation meant disdain or rejection. In a society where a young man and woman were rarely left alone without a chaperone, these silent codes were the only way to navigate the heart. However, beneath this veneer of politeness lay harsh taboos. To be idle was a sin. Even in social settings, women were expected to have busy hands with embroidery or knitting. Divorce was a social death sentence, particularly for women, who would often be cast out of their communities. Poverty was frequently viewed as a moral failing rather than a systemic issue, leading to the dreaded poorhouse, a place of shame that many families feared more than death itself. Even the way people died was governed by strict etiquette. Mourning was a formal, public process. A widow was expected to wear deep mourning, entirely black, non-reflective crepe clothing for at least a year and a day. Mirrors in the house were covered with black cloth, and clocks were stopped at the moment of death. These rituals gave the survivors a script to follow, a way to process the immense grief that came from a century where death was a constant, uninvited guest. As the 1800s came to a close, these rigid walls began to crumble, but they left behind a legacy of the American character, a blend of stoicism, privacy, and an intense focus on public image. The day may have been filled with dirt and sweat, but the 19th century soul was always dressed in Sunday best. For the first half of the 1800s, the concept of leisure was almost non-existent for the working class. If you weren't sleeping or praying, you were working. But as the mid-century approached, a revolutionary idea began to take hold in the American psyche: the weekend and the afternoon off. As machines took over the most grueling tasks, a tiny sliver of time opened up, and an entire industry rose to fill it with wonder, spectacle, and a bit of harmless scandal. The most electrifying event of the 19th century was the arrival of the traveling circus. In an age before television or internet, the circus was a sensory overload that people would talk about for a decade. When the posters appeared on the side of a barn, the entire county held its breath. The arrival of P.T. Barnum's greatest show on earth wasn't just entertainment, it was a window into the exotic. For a farm boy who had never been more than 20 miles from his birthplace, seeing an elephant or a tiger was like seeing a creature from another planet. The air would fill with the smell of sawdust, roasted peanuts, and coal smoke as the massive tents were hoisted by teams of horses and men. In the rapidly growing cities, the public park became the lungs of the urban population. Before the mid-1800s, there were few green spaces for the poor. If you wanted to see grass, you went to a cemetery. But the creation of spaces like New York's Central Park in the mid-1850s changed the urban day. On Sunday afternoons, the rigid social barriers softened slightly. You would see wealthy bankers in their top hats promenading alongside immigrant factory workers, all seeking the same thing: fresh air and a moment of quiet away from the soot of the chimneys. This era also saw the birth of organized sports. Baseball, which began as a disorganized town ball game played in pastures, evolved into the national pastime. By the 1860s, soldiers in the Civil War were playing it in their camps to pass the time between battles, and they brought the love of the game back to every corner of the country. It was the perfect 19th century sport. It required space, teamwork, and provided a theater for the grit that Americans valued so highly. For the more sedentary, the Lyceum movement offered intellectual leisure. Traveling lecturers, including figures like Ralph Emerson Walden or Mark Twain, would pack town halls. People would sit for hours in sweltering heat to listen to a man talk about philosophy, science, or travel. In the 1900s, a good orator was a rock star. This was the information age before the silicon chip. Knowledge was a form of entertainment. But even leisure had a 19th century edge. Pleasure gardens and early amusement piers like those at Coney Island began to offer thrill rides that were often terrifyingly unregulated. Early roller coasters and shooting the chutes provided a visceral rush of adrenaline that countered the monotony of factory life. As the sun set on these rare days of rest, the 19th century person returned to their routine with a renewed spirit. Leisure wasn't about tuning out, it was about filling up. It was a brief, colorful rebellion against the gray reality of the plow and the steam engine. The 1800s taught us that the more we work, the more we need to dream. And the circus, the park, and the lecture hall were the places where those dreams took flight.
As we stand at the end of this journey through the 1800s, we must ask, what remains of that world? To a modern eye, the 19th century looks like a distant, sepia-toned fever dream of struggle and soot. Yet, if you look closely at the walls of your home, the schedule of your day, and the very structure of your thoughts, you will find the fingerprints of the 1800s everywhere. We are the children of their revolution, living in a world they built with calloused hands and a relentless, stubborn optimism. The most enduring legacy of the 1800s is our relationship with time. Before this century, time was fluid, measured by the position of the sun or the length of a shadow. The 1800s gave us the standardized minute. The railroads demanded that 12 p.m. be the same in every town along the track, and the factories demanded that every minute be accounted for. When you check your watch or feel that phantom itch of anxiety when you're 5 minutes late for a meeting, you are feeling the ghost of the 19th century locomotive. They turned time into a commodity, and we have been spending it ever since. Physically, the 1800s reshaped the earth to fit human needs. The massive canals, the thousands of miles of iron rail, and the skeleton of the modern city, the sewers, the bridges, and the grid systems were all products of this era's obsession with progress. They didn't just inhabit the landscape, they conquered it. The 19th century was the last time a human could truly be lost or off the grid by simply walking 10 miles into the woods. By 1899, the telegram and the steamship had made the world a smaller, louder, and more connected place. We also inherited their contradictions. The 1800s was a century of soaring ideals, the abolition of slavery, the fight for women's suffrage, and the birth of public education. Yet it was also a century of brutal expansion, child labor, and environmental devastation. They were the first generation to realize that technology could solve almost any problem, but they were also the first to realize that technology could create horrors previously unimaginable. Perhaps the most poignant legacy is the 19th century work ethic. Americans are often characterized by a restless drive to produce, to get ahead, and to find worth in labor. This isn't an accident. It is a cultural inheritance from ancestors who knew that if they didn't spend 16 hours a day working, they would quite literally freeze or starve. That grit is baked into the DNA of the modern world. We may have traded the plow for the laptop, but the impulse to grind, to build, and to survive remains unchanged. As you look around your room tonight, remember the rule of the candle. Think of the silence, the cold, and the absolute darkness that defined the end of every day for your ancestors. Our modern world is a miracle of light and ease, bought with the sweat and exhaustion of those who lived through the 1800s. They were the bridge between the ancient world of wood and stone and the digital world of silicon and light. Their day is done, but their story is the reason we are here today. As we close this historical journey, we must turn our gaze back to the most invisible yet essential engine of the 19th century, the woman. If the 1800s was a century of iron and steam, it was also a century of cloth, yeast, and tireless care. While the history books often focus on the generals and the inventors, the daily reality of the 1800s was held together by the calloused hands of women who managed a complex domestic economy that would make a modern logistics manager dizzy. The 19th century woman was the primary manufacturer for the household. In the early 1800s, almost everything a family touched, the soap they washed with, the candles that lit their nights, the clothes on their backs, and the food in their bellies, passed through her hands. She was a master of chemistry, knowing exactly how to balance lye and fat to make soap that wouldn't burn the skin, and how to preserve meat in salt and smoke so it wouldn't kill her family in the lean months of February. Beyond the physical labor, women were the keepers of the moral compass. In a world that was rapidly becoming industrialized and often brutal, the home was viewed as a sacred haven. It was the woman's job to ensure that despite the mud and the toil, there was a space for beauty, prayer, and education. She was the first teacher her children ever knew, often teaching them to read by the light of a single candle after a day spent hauling water and scrubbing floors. The 1800s also saw the beginning of a quiet but unstoppable revolution in women's roles. As the century progressed, women moved out of the home and into the public sphere. They became the mill girls of the New England factories, the pioneer mothers who drove wagons across the treacherous Oregon Trail, and the nurses who redefined medicine on the blood-soaked battlefields of the Civil War. They began to organize, realizing that the grip they used to survive the farm could be used to win the right to vote and own property. By the end of the century, the new woman had emerged. She rode bicycles, a shocking display of independence, attended college in increasing numbers, and began to demand a seat at the table of the 20th century. The 1800s started with women as legal shadows of their husbands and ended with them as the primary drivers of social reform. When you look back at the 24 hours of a day in the 1800s, remember the peace of the evening and the fuel of the morning were provided by a woman who likely never sat down from dawn until the last coal was banked. Their legacy isn't just in the families they raised, but in the very resilience and multitasking spirit that defines the modern working world. They didn't just survive the 1800s, they wove the fabric of the 20th. While the farm was a kingdom of isolation, the town was the nervous system of the 1800s. For a rural family, a trip to the nearest settlement wasn't a casual errand. It was a major expedition, often planned weeks in advance. Setting out at 4 a.m. in a wagon, the jolting journey over corduroy roads, paths made of logs laid side by side, could take hours. But as the steeple of the local church or the smoke from the grist mill came into view, the isolation of the wilderness finally broke. The heart of every 19th century American town was the general store. Walking through its heavy oak doors was a sensory explosion. It smelled of a chaotic blend of coffee beans, cured tobacco, salted fish, kerosene, and bolts of unwashed calico. This wasn't just a place of business, it was the social media of the era. Near the potbelly stove in the center of the room, men sat on overturned crates, chewing tobacco and debating politics or crop prices. Here, news traveled by word of mouth, a neighbor's barn fire, a wedding in the next county,
or the escalating tensions leading toward a distant war. For the women, the general store was a rare window into a world of luxury. They would run their fingers over fine silks or examine porcelain dishes imported from Europe, though they likely only walked away with the essentials: a bag of sugar, a tin of saleratus, baking soda, or a specific gauge of sewing thread. Commerce was rarely conducted with cash. Instead, it was a complex dance of barter and credit. A farmer's wife would bring in a basket of eggs or hand-churned butter, and the storekeeper would carefully weigh them, marking the value against the family's running debt. Beyond the store, the town was a hive of specialized muscle. You could hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the loom from the textile mill, or the deafening roar of the water-powered sawmill. The blacksmith was the most vital man in the community. His forge was a place of sparks and sweat, where he didn't just fix tools, he created the very hardware of civilization, from horseshoe nails to hinges. The social hierarchy was visible in every interaction. The local lawyer or doctor, dressed in a slightly cleaner wool coat, moved with an air of authority, while the hired hands and laborers worked the docks or the warehouses with stained hands and stooped backs. Yet, despite the grime and the labor, there was a profound sense of belonging. In the 1800s, your reputation was your currency. Everyone knew your father, your debts, and your work ethic. As the sun began to dip, the wagons were loaded with supplies, and the families began the long, dark trek back to their homesteads. They left the noise of the town behind, but they carried with them the stories and news that would be dissected and retold around the hearth for the next month. The town was a reminder that they weren't just individuals struggling against nature. They were part of a growing, heaving nation that was being built one horseshoe and one barter at a time. In a world of relentless, bone-breaking toil, there was only one day that stood still: Sunday. In the 1800s, the Sabbath was not just a religious obligation, it was a societal law. For 6 days, the human body was a machine, but on the seventh, it was required to be a soul. To a modern observer, a 19th century Sunday might seem restrictive, but to the laborer of 1840, it was the only thing keeping them from a total physical collapse. The transition began on Saturday night. The Saturday night bath was a ritual of purification. Using the same large galvanized tub, the family would take turns scrubbing away a week's worth of field dust and engine grease, starting with the father and ending with the youngest child. The water grew cold and gray, but by the end, they were clean for the Lord. Clothes that had been painstakingly washed and pressed earlier in the week, the Sunday best, were laid out. These were often the only garments the family owned that weren't patched or stained. Sunday morning brought a strange, heavy silence to the landscape. The rhythmic thud of the axe and the shouting of teamsters vanished. The family piled into the wagon, traveling perhaps 5 or 10 miles to the local church. The church was the literal and figurative center of the community. It was the only place where the isolated farm wife could speak to another woman, and where the lonely frontiersman could feel part of a tribe. The service itself was an endurance test. In an era before short attention spans, a sermon could last 3 hours. The pews were hard, unpadded wood, designed to keep you awake and attentive to the preacher's warnings of fire and brimstone. There was no heating in the winter, save for small foot stoves filled with hot coals brought from home. Yet people listened with an intensity we now reserve for blockbuster movies. This was their education, their philosophy, and their news. After the service, the social hour took place in the churchyard. This was the only time for courtship. Young men, their hair slicked down with hog lard or bear grease, would attempt to catch the eye of a girl under the watchful gaze of her father. Business deals were quietly whispered, and sick neighbors were checked on. The rest of the Sunday was spent in holy idleness. No heavy work was permitted. You didn't plow, you didn't sew, and in some strict households you didn't even whistle. The afternoon was spent reading the Bible, or perhaps a Pilgrim's Progress by the window. For the children, this was often the hardest part of the week, forced to sit still when their bodies were used to constant motion. As the sun set on Sunday, a specific kind of melancholy settled over the household. The great rest was ending. The Sunday best were folded back into cedar chests, and the rough, sweat-stained work clothes were pulled out for the morning. The peace of the Sabbath was a thin veil, and beneath it, the gears of the 19th century work week were already beginning to grind again.
In the 1860s, the rhythm of the 19th century day was shattered by the drumbeat of war. For 4 agonizing years, the typical day was replaced by a landscape of smoke, steel, and sorrow. The American Civil War didn't just happen on battlefields. It invaded every kitchen, every factory, and every farm. It was the moment when the 1800s lost its innocence and became a century of industrial-scale destruction. For the soldier, the day was a grueling paradox of boredom and terror. Most of his time wasn't spent fighting, but marching. A soldier carried the world on his back, a heavy wool rucksack, a canteen, and a musket. Breakfast was often hardtack, a cracker so hard it earned the nickname molar breaker, often infested with weevils. To eat it, soldiers had to soak it in coffee or fry it in pork fat. The day was measured by the bugle call, reveille at dawn, the long march through the dust, and the evening taps. Inside the camps, hygiene was a disaster. More men died from the invisible enemy of disease, dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia, than from miniballs. The 1800s' lack of germ theory meant that surgeons often operated with unwashed hands and blood-stained tools. A soldier wounded in the afternoon might wait until twilight for an amputation, the only anesthesia being a gulp of whiskey or a leather strap to bite on. Back on the home front, the day changed entirely for women. With millions of men away at the front, women became the managers of the economy. In the North, they flooded the factories to make ammunition and uniforms. In the South, they faced the great scarcity. As the naval blockade tightened, everyday items vanished. A day in 1863 might be spent boiling old curtains to make dresses or parching corn to create a bitter substitute for coffee. Salt became more valuable than gold because without it, meat could not be preserved. The 19th century day became a lesson in making do or doing without. The Civil War also accelerated the 1800s technological path. The telegraph, which once sent personal news, now carried casualty lists that were posted daily in town squares. Families would gather in silence, their hearts pounding as they scanned for a familiar name. The night watch was no longer just about fire. It was about the fear of a telegram delivery in the dark. When the war finally ended in 1865, the 19th century day could never go back to the way it was. The trauma had hardened the national character. The industrial machine of the North had proven its power, and the rural stillness of the South lay in ruins. The survivors returned home to a world that was faster, grimmer, and more united by grief. They had seen the worst of the century, and it made the simple peace of a farmhouse evening seem like a miracle they would never take for granted again. By the 1880s and 1890s, the raw, muddy struggle of the early century was being gilded over with a layer of gold and electricity. This was the Gilded Age, a time of staggering inequality where the 19th century day split into 2 entirely different worlds. For the robber barons like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller, the day was a spectacle of excess. For the first time, a human could spend their day in a climate-controlled mansion, traveling in a private rail car, and eating food chilled by massive blocks of ice harvested from the mountains.
The greatest miracle of this era was the death of the candle. In 1879, Thomas Edison successfully tested the incandescent bulb. To the person of the 1800s, this was nothing short of magic. The sun had finally been tamed. In the major cities, the night was no longer a time of danger and retreat. It became the evening out. Theaters, restaurants, and department stores began to glow with a steady white light that didn't flicker or smell of burning fat. This was also the birth of the consumer day. The late 1800s introduced the department store, cathedrals of commerce like Macy's or Wanamaker's. A woman's day might now include shopping as a leisure activity. These stores were the first places to use fixed pricing, meaning you no longer had to barter or haggle over the price of a pair of gloves. You simply walked in, saw the price tag, and paid with the new standardized currency of a booming nation. However, just blocks from these glittering palaces, the other half lived a day of unimaginable density. In the tenements of New York and Chicago, thousands of immigrants lived in rooms where the sun never reached. A day for a garment worker involved sweating, working 16 hours in a windowless room, sewing the very lace and silk sold in the department stores uptown. They were the fuel for the Gilded Age's engine, their lives a frantic race to earn enough pennies for a loaf of bread and a spot on a shared mattress. Communication had also reached a fever pitch. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, patented in 1876, was beginning to appear in offices. The day was now interrupted by the ringing of a bell, a sound that demanded immediate attention. The slow, thoughtful pace of the handwritten letter was being replaced by the instant conversation. The world was becoming loud, fast, and demanding. As the 1800s drew to a close, the gilded glow began to reveal the modern world we recognize today. We had the light bulb, the telephone, the department store, and the skyscraper. We had conquered the wilderness and built an empire of iron. The people of 1899 stood on the threshold of the 20th century, looking back at 100 years of transformation that had turned a collection of isolated farms into a global superpower. They were tired, they were proud, and they were ready for the future.
As the 19th century matured, a new crisis emerged that defined the daily experience of every American: the sheer logistics of staying alive in a crowded world. In 1800, you could drink from almost any stream. By 1880, that same act was a game of Russian roulette. The day, for a city dweller, became a constant negotiation with filth, leading to one of the greatest yet most overlooked engineering triumphs in human history. The morning ritual of the hall was finally being challenged by the introduction of indoor plumbing, but for most, it was a slow transition. If you lived in a mid-century city, your water came from a communal pump at the end of the block. You carried it up 3 flights of stairs in heavy buckets. This water was used for everything: cooking, washing, and drinking. The problem? The privy, the outdoor toilet, was often just a few yards away from the well. This proximity created a terrifying daily reality where a single case of cholera could turn an entire neighborhood into a graveyard within 48 hours. The scent of the 1800s is something modern audiences would find unbearable. It wasn't just wood smoke and sweat, it was the smell of thousands of horses. In a city like New York or Chicago, horses were the engines of the day. But those engines produced millions of pounds of manure every single day. The street sweepers, often young boys, spent their entire day dodging wagons to shovel the waste into piles. When it rained, the streets turned into a toxic soup of mud and manure that splashed onto the hemlines of the long dresses women were required to wear. But then came the sanitary revolution. Mid-century visionaries realized that the miasma, bad air, wasn't the killer, the water was. Massive projects like the Croton Aqueduct in New York or the reversing of the Chicago River were the moonshots of the 1800s.
Suddenly, the day changed. A housewife could turn a tap and see clear, cold water. The night soil men, who spent their nights emptying out outhouses, were replaced by underground sewer systems. This change brought about a new obsession, the modern bathroom. By the 1890s, the clawfoot tub and the pull-chain toilet became symbols of the middle class. The daily scrub was no longer a Saturday night ordeal. It was becoming a mark of civilization. This shift in hygiene did more to extend the human lifespan than almost any medicine of the era. It took the 24-hour day out of the shadow of the plague and into the light of the modern era. As the sun set on the century, the world was cleaner, safer, and much more complex. The struggle was no longer just against the forest or the weather. It was a struggle to maintain the massive, hidden machines, the pipes, the pumps, and the filters that allowed millions of people to live side by side without dying of their own waste. The daily routine had become a miracle of infrastructure. We have reached the end of our 1,000-word-per-chapter odyssey. We have traveled from the flint and steel fire of 1800 to the humming telephone wires of 1899. We have seen how a day was transformed from a physical battle for heat and light into a coordinated industrial march. The people of the 1800s didn't just live through history, they invented the way we live now. Their grit wasn't a choice, it was a requirement. Every convenience we have today, the light that never fails, the water that always flows, and the food that never spoils, is a testament to their 24-hour struggle. They were the architects of the modern day, and though their names are mostly forgotten, their sweat is in the foundations of every building we inhabit.
While we've explored the broad strokes of industry and travel, the most intimate theater of the 1800s was the kitchen. To a modern American, a 19th century kitchen was less a room and more a full-time chemical processing plant. There were no refrigerators, no thermostats, and no quick meals. Every calorie consumed by the family was earned through hours of manual labor and precise temperature control. The centerpiece of this world was the cast iron range. Before its mid-century arrival, women cooked over open hearths, a dangerous, back-breaking method that required hanging heavy iron pots from cranes. The cast iron stove was a marvel of the age, but it was a temperamental beast. It had no on switch. A woman had to know exactly which type of wood, hickory for high heat, oak for a long burn, to use to reach the right temperature for bread. She judged the heat not with a dial, but by flicking a drop of water onto the surface or holding her hand inside the oven to see how many seconds she could endure the sting. Food preservation was the daily obsession. In an era without refrigeration, fresh was a fleeting luxury. Meat was kept in a smokehouse or submerged in heavy brine barrels in the cellar. Root vegetables were buried in sand in a root cellar to keep them from freezing or sprouting. If you wanted milk, you didn't go to the store, you went to the barn, and then you spent hours in the kitchen setting the cream to turn into butter or cheese. The 1800s was the era of the mason jar, patented in 1858, which finally allowed families to capture the flavors of summer, peaches, beans, and tomatoes, to survive the long, gray winters. The day in the kitchen was also a battle against spoilage and pests. Meat flies were a constant threat, and bread had to be baked every few days to avoid mold. The work was endless, peeling, pitting, salting, kneading, and scrubbing. The kitchen floor was often a scrubbed sand surface, and the dishes were cleaned with lye soap and boiling water hauled from the stove. As the century closed, the kitchen began to change. The arrival of the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with zinc and filled with a massive block of ice delivered by the Iceman, allowed for the first glimpses of modern food storage. Canned goods from companies like Campbell's and Heinz began to appear on shelves, offering the first shortcut meals.
The 1800s kitchen was the place where the raw materials of nature were transformed into the energy that built the nation, one labor-intensive meal at a time. We have now explored the 1800s from the dirt of the frontier to the grease of the factory, from the silence of the Sabbath to the roar of the locomotive. We've looked at the clothes, the medicine, the waste, and the food. If there is one thing to take away for your video, it is this. The 1800s was the century of the hand. Almost everything a person saw, used, or ate had been touched, shaped, or carried by a human hand. There was no automation that didn't require a human operator nearby. This created a world of immense physical connection, but also immense physical cost. When your audience watches your video, they shouldn't just see the past, they should see the incredible, gritty foundation of their own lives. We are the first generations in human history to live without the daily struggle for basic heat, light, and water. The 1800s is the story of how we got here.
The year is 1850, and the world does not wake up to the gentle chime of a smartphone. It wakes up to the biting, relentless chill of a house that has lost its fight with the winter night. You are huddled beneath 4 layers of heavy wool blankets, but your breath still forms a translucent cloud in the air before you. The floorboards beneath your bed are ice cold, and the prospect of swinging your legs out from under the covers feels like a leap into a frozen lake. This is the first reality of the 19th century. Warmth is a luxury you have to earn. Your day begins not with a shower, but with a struggle for light. In the dimness of the room, you reach for a match, a relatively new and temperamental invention to light a tallow candle. The smell hits you instantly, the acrid, fatty scent of rendered animal fat. It isn't the clean, vanilla-scented wax of the future. It's smoky, flickering, and dim. By this weak yellow light, you find the wash basin. The water inside has a thin skin of ice that you have to crack with your knuckles. There is no hot tap. You splash the freezing water onto your face, a shock to the system that replaces the need for caffeine. Dressing is a ritual of layers. For a man, it's the stiff linen shirt, the suspenders, and the heavy trousers. For a woman, it is an architectural feat, the chemise, the corset, tightened until the lungs feel constricted, the petticoats, and finally the heavy wool dress. Every piece of clothing is designed for utility and warmth, not comfort. By the time you are dressed, your fingers are numb and the house is still silent, save for the distant sound of a horse's hooves clattering on the cobblestones outside. You head downstairs to the heart of the home, the hearth. In 1850, the stove is the sun around which the family orbits. If the fire went out overnight, you were in trouble. You kneel in the ashes, scraping away the remnants of yesterday's wood to coax a new flame into existence. This is backbreaking, filthy work. Your fingernails are permanently stained with soot, a mark of the era. As the wood catches, the kitchen begins to groan to life. Breakfast is a far cry from a quick bowl of cereal. It is a heavy, greasy affair designed to fuel 10 hours of manual labor. You smell the salt pork frying in a cast-iron skillet, the smoke filling the room because the chimney draw is poor. There's cornmeal mush or hoe cakes washed down with coffee that is more chicory than bean, sweetened with dark, viscous molasses. There is no white sugar here. That is for the wealthy. You eat in relative silence, the heavy pewter spoons clinking against ceramic bowls. Beyond the walls of your home, the city is screaming to life. You open the front door and the sensory assault is immediate. The 1800s were not clean. The streets are a chaotic slurry of mud, garbage, and horse manure. There are no bin men, no street sweepers. The great stench is a constant companion. You step out onto the wooden sidewalk, avoiding the pigs that roam the alleys, acting as the city's only waste management system. The air is thick with coal smoke, a persistent gray haze that clings to the buildings and settles in your lungs. You see the chimney sweeps, young boys covered in soot heading toward their first jobs of the day. You see the water carriers and the milkmen, their carts rattling over the uneven stones. Everyone is moving with a sense of urgent survival. In this era, if you don't work, you don't eat. There is no safety net, only the relentless ticking of the pocket watch and the physical demand of the morning. As you head toward your place of work, be it a crowded factory, a dusty legal office, or the docks, the sun finally crests the horizon, revealing a world of grit, ambition, and unfiltered human struggle.
By 10 a.m., the romanticized simplicity of the 19th century has completely evaporated, replaced by the grueling reality of physical endurance. Whether you are a laborer on the docks, a clerk in a suffocating counting house, or a woman managing a household, the midday hours are a relentless test of the human frame. There are no ergonomic chairs, no air conditioning, and no labor laws to protect you from the exhaustion setting in. If you are a man working in the city, you are likely surrounded by the deafening roar of the Industrial Revolution. Factories are cathedrals of iron and steam, but they are also death traps. The air inside is a thick soup of lint, coal dust, and grease. The machines have no safety guards. A momentary lapse in concentration could cost you a finger or a limb, and in 1850, such an injury usually means the end of your earning potential, and perhaps your life. The heat near the furnaces is unbearable, reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, yet you wear thick wool because denim hasn't yet become the universal uniform of the working class. Your shirt is plastered to your back, soaked in a mixture of sweat and machine oil. For those in the cleaner professions, the misery is different but no less taxing. A clerk sits on a high wooden stool, hunched over a ledger for 6 hours straight. Every word must be written in perfect copperplate script with a quill or a steel-tipped dip pen. There is no undo button. A single ink blot can ruin a day's work, requiring the page to be scraped thin with a penknife or entirely rewritten. The room is dim, lit by flickering gas lamps that hiss and leak small amounts of carbon monoxide, leading to the afternoon headache that almost every office worker considers a normal part of life. Meanwhile, for a woman at home, the midday grind is an athletic feat. Monday is laundry day, a 12-hour nightmare. She isn't just doing a load, she's hauling gallons of water from a backyard pump, boiling it over a roaring stove, and using a heavy corrugated washboard to scrub stains out of thick fabrics by hand. Her knuckles are raw and bleeding from the lye soap, a harsh chemical concoction that eats away at the skin. The ironing involves heating 7-pound sad irons on the stove. If the iron is too cold, it does nothing. If it's too hot, it scorches the only good dress she owns. There is no rest, only the transition from one chore to the next. Noon brings the dinner hour. In the 1800s, this is the main meal of the day, but for the working class, it is a rushed, functional event. If you are lucky, you head to a sixpenny eating house. These are cramped, dark basements where strangers sit elbow to elbow on long benches. The menu is repetitive: boiled beef of questionable age, gray cabbage, and heavy bread. The food is unseasoned, save for a massive amount of salt used for preservation. You don't linger over conversation, you bolt your food down to maximize your few minutes of rest. The sensory experience of the midday street is at its peak. This is the loudest the 19th century gets. The clatter of the 1800s is a specific metallic sound, iron-rimmed wagon wheels striking granite cobblestones. It's a constant, bone-shaking vibration that makes the very ground tremble. Thousands of horses are straining under the whip, their breath heavy in the humid air. The smell is a thick, invisible wall, a mix of horse urine, rotting vegetable scraps thrown into the gutters, and the metallic tang of the nearby blacksmith's forge. By 2 p.m., the midday slump hits, but there is no caffeine fix available at the corner. You might drink small beer,
a weak fermented ale, because the local well water is often contaminated with seepage from nearby outhouses. Cholera and typhoid are not distant fears. They are the invisible monsters lurking in every cup of clear water. You drink the ale not to get buzzed, but to stay hydrated without dying. As the sun begins its slow descent, the physical toll becomes visible. You see it in the bowed shoulders of the men carrying timber at the wharf, and the hollowed eyes of the seamstresses working in sweated shops, stitching 20 shirts a day for pennies. The optimism of the morning has turned into a grim determination to simply make it to sunset. The 1800s don't ask for your best, they demand your everything.
As the sun dips below the horizon, the 19th century world undergoes a chilling transformation. In our modern world, the night is just a darker version of the day, lit by LEDs and neon. But in 1850, when the sun vanishes, the shadows don't just grow, they reclaim the territory. The transition from the workday to the evening is not a time of relaxation, it is a time of heightened vigilance. The end of the work shift is marked by the sounding of steam whistles and the tolling of church bells. A sea of weary bodies pours out of factories and shops, but they aren't heading home to Netflix and chill. They're heading into a city that is becoming increasingly treacherous. Street lighting is a luxury. If you're in a major city like New York or London, you might have the flickering, eerie glow of gas lamps. These lamps cast long, dancing shadows and emit a sickly greenish hue, hissed out through iron pipes that occasionally leak or explode. If you're in a smaller town, you're navigating in pitch blackness, perhaps carrying a small tin lantern filled with whale oil. Walking home is a tactical maneuver. This is the era of the footpad and the garroter. Without a professional, centralized police force in many areas, the dark alleys are hunting grounds for criminals. You keep your head down, your hand perhaps clutching a heavy walking stick, not for style, but for defense. The silence of the night is punctuated by the hollow thwack of a night watchman's club against a stone wall, a signal to other watchmen that he is still on his beat. Returning home doesn't mean the work is over. The evening meal, supper, is a dim affair. The family gathers around a single oil lamp or a couple of tallow candles. Because light is expensive, the family stays close together in one room. This forced intimacy is a hallmark of the era. You might read a newspaper, but the strain on your eyes is immense. The fine print of the 1800s, combined with the wavering yellow light, leads to chronic eye strain. The air inside the home has changed too. With the windows shut tight against the miasma, the Victorian belief that bad air caused disease, the indoor atmosphere becomes a toxic cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sulfurous fumes of the coal stove. If you look at the walls, you'll notice they're stained a dingy yellow-brown. This isn't paint. It's the accumulation of soot and nicotine that coats every surface of 19th century life. Then comes the most dreaded task of the night, the chamber pot. With no indoor plumbing, the trek to the outdoor privy in the dark is a cold, terrifying journey you'd rather avoid. Instead, the ceramic pot under the bed becomes the solution. The smell is something modern people can hardly imagine, a permanent, underlying stench of waste that even the strongest floral perfumes can't mask. Preparation for sleep is a battle against the elements. You don't just go to bed. You use a bed warmer, a brass pan filled with hot coals, to slide between the icy sheets to prevent your body from going into shock. You wear a nightcap, not because it's fashionable, but because heat escapes through the head, and in a room where the temperature might drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, a nightcap is a survival tool. As you finally blow out the candle, the smell of burnt wick lingers in the air. The quiet of the 1800s night isn't peaceful, it's heavy. You lie there listening to the scurrying of rats in the walls, a sound so common that most people don't even wake up to it. You drift off to sleep knowing that in just 5 or 6 hours, the freezing cold will wake you up and you will have to do it all over again.
This was the regular day. There was no weekend, no vacation, and no retirement. There was only the cycle of the sun, the heat of the stove, and the relentless grit of a world that was just beginning to learn how to be modern.
To survive a day in the 1800s, you didn't just need a strong back, you needed an iron immune system. In a world before germ theory was widely accepted, people lived in a state of blissful ignorance that was, in reality, a death sentence. To the average person in 1850, diseases weren't caused by bacteria or viruses. They were caused by miasma, or bad smells. And in the 19th century, everything smelled bad. If you woke up with a dry cough or a fever during your typical day, you didn't call a doctor, not unless you were prepared to die faster. Medicine was a terrifying frontier. A visit to a physician often involved bloodletting, the ancient practice of draining your blood to balance your humors, or being prescribed mercury and arsenic for a simple stomachache. These cures were often more lethal than the ailments themselves. The most basic act of hygiene, washing your hands, was almost non-existent. Surgeons would often move from performing an autopsy on a rotting corpse straight to delivering a baby without so much as wiping their blades or rinsing their fingers. They took pride in their surgical stink, believing that the blood and gore caked onto their black coats were badges of experience. For you, the common person, this meant that a simple scratch from a rusty nail or a small cut while preparing dinner could turn into gangrene or sepsis within 48 hours. Then there was the water. While we take a glass of clear tap water for granted, for you, every sip is a gamble. The Broad Street pump era taught us that city wells were often located just feet away from overflowing cesspools. You might notice the water in your pitcher has a slightly yellow tint or a faint earthy smell. You drink it anyway because thirst is immediate and cholera is a maybe. Within hours, an entire family could be struck down by the Blue Death, so named because the dehydration was so rapid and extreme that the victim's skin would turn a ghostly, shrunken blue before they expired. Personal grooming was equally hazardous. If you wanted to look your best for the day, you might apply some cosmetics, but beauty in the 1800s was toxic. Women used Venetian cerus, a skin whitener made of lead, which slowly poisoned their nervous systems and caused their teeth to rot. Men used hair tonics filled with flammable spirits. Even the wallpaper in your home was out to get you. The vibrant Scheele's green pigment that was so popular in Victorian parlors was infused with high levels of arsenic. As the damp walls breathed, they released toxic fumes into the unventilated rooms where you slept. Dentistry was perhaps the greatest horror of the midday hour. If a tooth began to throb, there were no fillings or root canals. You went to the local barber or blacksmith. Without a drop of anesthesia, save for perhaps a heavy swig of cheap whiskey, you were pinned into a chair while the dentist used a pair of literal pliers to yank the tooth from your jaw. The scream would be drowned out by the noise of the street, and you would be expected to head back to work with a mouthful of bloody rags. By the time evening rolled around, the physical toll of living in such a contaminated world was visible on every face. Pockmarks from smallpox, the sunken chests of those with consumption or tuberculosis, and the yellowed eyes of those with failing livers were not rare sights. They were the norm. You didn't expect to live to be 80. In fact, if you made it to 40, you were considered an elder. Life was a fragile thread, easily snapped by an invisible world of microbes that no one yet understood. As you tucked yourself into bed, the cough of a child in the next room wasn't just a nuisance. It was a sound that could keep a parent awake in cold, shivering terror, wondering if the white plague had finally come to claim its next victim. In the 1800s, the concept of equality was a radical dream, not a lived reality. Your experience of a regular day depended entirely on the quality of the fabric on your back and the accent in your voice. The social divide wasn't just a gap, it was a canyon, and crossing it was nearly impossible. As you move through the city in the late afternoon, the contrast between the upper 10 and the submerged 10th is enough to make your head spin. If you are a member of the elite, your day is a choreographed performance of etiquette. You live in a brownstone or a manor house with high ceilings and heavy velvet curtains designed to muffle the sounds of the rabble outside. You don't work with your hands, you manage interests. Your biggest stressor is a breach of social protocol, wearing the wrong cravat to a dinner party or failing to leave a calling card at the correct hour. You are insulated from the filth by a small army of servants who exist as invisible people, moving through back hallways and sleeping in unheated attics so that your life remains seamless. But for the rest of the world, life is a desperate scramble for dignity in a system designed to strip it away. In 1850, poverty was often viewed not as a misfortune, but as a moral failing. If you fell behind on your rent or couldn't pay your debts, you didn't just get a bad credit score, you were thrown into debtor's prison. These were grim, private institutions where you were charged for your own room and board. If you couldn't pay, you stayed indefinitely, trapped in a cycle of debt that often ended in death. Crime was the inevitable shadow of this inequality. Without a modern social safety net, the desperate turned to predatory survival. The streets were filled with artful dodgers, children as young as 6 or 7 who were experts at dipping into the pockets of unsuspecting gentlemen. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a highly organized underworld. You had mudsills who scoured the riverbanks for scrap metal, and resurrection men who earned a gruesome living by digging up fresh corpses to sell to medical schools for dissection. Justice in the 1800s was swift, public, and brutal. There was a morbid fascination with punishment. If a criminal was caught, their trial might last only minutes before a sentence was handed down. Public hangings were still common occurrences, drawing massive crowds that treated the execution like a carnivalesque sporting event. People would bring their children, buy snacks from street vendors, and jostle for a better view of the short drop and a sudden stop. It was a cold reminder from the state. Step out of line, and this is your end. For the working woman, the social fabric was even more restrictive. A woman's reputation was her only currency. To be seen walking alone after dark or to be caught in the company of the wrong person could result in social death. For the millions of women working in domestic service, their lives belonged to their employers. They worked 16-hour days, often forbidden from having visitors or even followers, boyfriends. One mistake, a broken teacup or perceived attitude, meant being fired without a character. Without a written reference from a previous employer, a woman was essentially unemployable, often leaving her with no choice but to enter the grim world of the fallen. As the gas lamps begin to flicker out and the city settles into a tense, heavy quiet, you realize that the 1800s were governed by a rigid hierarchy of fear. The rich feared the contagion of the poor feared the hunger of tomorrow, and everyone feared a legal system that favored the powerful. The regular day wasn't just about surviving the cold or the disease, it was about navigating a world where your worth was measured by the coins in your pocket and the status of your birth. The sun has set on another day of the 19th century. You close your eyes, the smell of coal and the distant echo of a watchman's rattle in your ears, knowing that tomorrow the hierarchy will demand its tribute all over again.
After a day defined by bone-deep exhaustion and rigid social rules, the human spirit in 1850 craves one thing, an escape. But in the 19th century, leisure is often as gritty and dangerous as the work itself. There are no cinemas or radios. If you want to forget your troubles, you have to seek out the raw, visceral world of Victorian entertainment, a world of flickering gaslight, loud music, and cheap thrills. For the working man, the sanctuary is the gin palace. These are not just bars. There are architectural illusions designed to make a pauper feel like a king for the price of a penny. While your tenement home is dark and damp, the gin palace is ablaze with enormous mirrors, polished brass, and ornate gas chandeliers. The air is a thick, choking fog of tobacco smoke and the sweet medicinal scent of low-grade gin, often stretched with turpentine or sulfuric acid to give it an extra kick. Here, the regular day is drowned in liquid fire. Men and women huddled together, singing bawdy songs to the tune of a tinny piano, momentarily forgetting the children crying in cold beds or the foreman's threats. If you crave something more highbrow, you might head to the music hall. This is the birthplace of variety entertainment. For a few cents, you sit in a rowdy, packed auditorium where the audience is as much a part of the show as the performers. People yell at the stage, throw orange peels at bad singers, and cheer for the strong man or the bearded ladies. It is a chaotic, sensory overload. On that stage, you see the world's curiosities, acrobats from distant lands, magicians performing spirit rappings, and sentimental singers who bring the entire house to tears with songs about dying orphans. But there is a darker side to Victorian escapism. The 1800s were obsessed with the macabre. If a high-profile murder occurred, thousands would flock to the scene to buy souvenir pieces of wood from the victim's door. Public anatomical museums displayed wax figures of diseased organs and freaks of nature, blurring the line between education and voyeurism. Even the penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized stories printed on coarse paper, were filled with tales of vampires, spring-heeled jacks, and grisly urban legends. You read these by the dying light of a candle, your heart racing, finding comfort in the fact that, as bad as your day was, at least you weren't being hunted by a phantom in the London fog. For the wealthy, entertainment is a weapon of status. The opera or the theater is a place to be seen rather than to see. The upper class sits in private boxes, draped in silk, peering through opera glasses, not at the stage, but at the rival families in the boxes opposite them. To them, leisure is a calculated game of high society, where a misplaced laugh or an unrefined gesture could lead to social exile. As the night reaches its deepest point, the streets belong to the night owls and the desperate. The sounds of the day, the hammers and the hooves, are replaced by the clinking of glasses and the distant rhythmic chanting of a street preacher warning of the apocalypse. You stumble back toward your room, your head spinning from the gin or the excitement of the music hall. The escapism of the 1800s doesn't offer peace, it offers a distraction. It provides a temporary shield against the crushing weight of a world that views you as just another gear in the industrial machine. As you blow out your final candle, the ringing in your ears from the music hall fades, replaced by the familiar, cold silence of the night. You have survived the work, the hunger, and the filth. You have even found a moment of joy. But as the clock on the mantel ticks toward midnight, the cycle prepares to reset.
The regular day we have walked through is not a static picture in a history book. It is a world in the middle of a violent, beautiful, and terrifying transformation. By the late 1850s, the very air you breathe begins to hum with the vibrations of change. The Industrial Revolution isn't just building factories, it is rewriting the human DNA of time itself. For thousands of years, humans lived by the sun and the seasons. In the 1800s, for the first time in history, humanity begins to live by the tick of the machine. As you stand on a street corner in the fading twilight of this era, you witness the birth of the standardized hour. Before this, every town had its own time based on the sun's position. If it was noon in New York, it might be 12:12 in Philadelphia. But the coming of the iron horse, the steam locomotive, changes everything. The train demands a schedule. Suddenly, your regular day is no longer measured by how much light is left in the sky, but by a rigid, unforgiving mechanical clock. The stress of being late is a new modern poison entering the human psyche. The skyline is also shifting. The steeples of churches, once the tallest points in any city, are being overtaken by the blackened chimneys of industry. Science is beginning to peel back the veil of the miasma.
A few radical thinkers are starting to suggest that perhaps it isn't bad air killing the children, but tiny invisible organisms in the water. You see the first major civil engineering projects, massive brick sewers being laid beneath the mud, veins of a new civilization designed to carry away the filth that has defined your life. These are the cathedrals of the underworld, and they will save more lives than any doctor of the age. Communication is shattering the silence of the past. The telegraph, the Victorian internet, means that news of a war in Europe or a gold strike in California reaches your ears in hours rather than months. Your world is shrinking. The isolation of the 1800s is dying. You are no longer just a citizen of a town. You are becoming a node in a global network. The regular day is becoming faster, louder, and more connected. Even the way you see the night is changing. In the final years of the century, the flickering, stinking tallow candle is being replaced by the steady, humless glow of the incandescent bulb. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla are preparing to banish the shadows forever. The dangers of the night we explored will soon be pushed back by the flip of a switch, turning the 24-hour cycle into a playground for the modern world. As you look back at the person you were at the start of this day, shivering under wool blankets, cracking ice in a wash basin, and dodging cholera in the streets, you realize you are looking at the last generation of ancient humans. The people of the 1800s were the bridge. They endured the maximum amount of physical hardship so that the foundations of the modern world could be poured. Their grit, their soot-stained hands, and their resilience are the silent ghosts haunting every skyscraper and smartphone of today. The day ends not with a conclusion, but with a transition. The sun sets on the horse and carriage, the whale oil lamp, and the hand-stitched life. When it rises again, it will shine on a world of steel, electricity, and the frantic, wonderful chaos of the 20th century. You have survived a day in the 1800s. You have felt the weight of its iron and the chill of its nights. And as you step out of the fog of history, you carry with you the realization that progress was paid for in the sweat and blood of those who lived this regular day.
While the world outside is vibrating with the roar of locomotives and the hum of new factories, the true battlefield of the 1800s remains within the four walls of the home. For the 19th century woman, there is no such thing as a day off. Her existence is a relentless cycle of production and preservation, a literal war against decay, hunger, and filth. To understand the 1800s, you must understand the sheer physical exhaustion of the Victorian housewife. The Industrial Revolution has reached the kitchen, but it hasn't made things easier. It has only changed the nature of the labor. The open hearth has been replaced by the cast iron range. It is a massive black beast that dominates the room. It doesn't just turn on, it must be fed. Every morning she must haul scuttles of heavy coal from the cellar, clean out the clinkers from the previous day, and blacklead the iron to keep it from rusting. The heat it radiates is stifling, turning the kitchen into a furnace even in the height of July. Food preparation is a test of chemistry and strength. There are no cans to open or frozen bags to thaw. Every loaf of bread is kneaded by hand until the shoulders ache. Every chicken is plucked, gutted, and singed. If the family wants butter, she spends an hour at the churn, the rhythmic thump slosh of the cream marking the passage of time. The air is thick with the smell of boiling cabbage and rendered lard. Preservation is the obsession of the season. In the late afternoon, she is likely hovering over a steaming pot of vinegar and sugar, pickling everything from beets to pig's feet to ensure the family survives the coming winter. Then there is the secret war of the 19th century, the battle against insects. Without window screens or modern pesticides, the home is under constant siege.
flies swarm the food, and bedbugs are an accepted, if loathed, reality of sleep. A meticulous woman spends hours stoving her bedding or washing the bed frames with corrosive turpentine and mercuric chloride. The very chemicals she uses to keep her home clean are slowly poisoning her, leading to the chronic vapors or fainting spells so often attributed to delicate female nerves. Socially, the home is her sphere, a gilded cage of expectations. The cult of domesticity dictates that she must be the moral anchor of the family. While her husband deals with the corrupt world of business, she must maintain a sanctuary of Victorian virtue. This means teaching the children their catechism, managing the complex social hierarchy of the neighborhood, and ensuring that even in poverty, the family maintains a respectable appearance. A frayed collar or a dirty window isn't just a chore undone, it's a public admission of moral failure. By the time the lamp is lit for the evening, her hands tell the story of the century. They are scarred by hot grease, swollen from lye water, and calloused by the broom. As she sits by the fire to do the evening mending, darning socks and patching trousers by the weak, flickering light, she isn't just a mother or a wife. She is the invisible engine of the 19th century. Without her unceasing, unpaid labor, the entire structure of the industrial age would collapse in a single day. As she finally unties her apron and prepares for a few hours of fitful sleep, she knows that the fire in the stove is already dying. Tomorrow at 5 a.m., the beast will be hungry again, and the cycle of the regular day will demand her tribute once more.
If you were a regular person in the 1800s, there was a high probability you weren't living in a cozy cottage or a grand manor. You were likely one of the millions packed into the tenements, the dark, suffocating heart of the industrial city. To a U.S. audience, this is the story of the Lower East Side of New York or the slums of Chicago. This is the 19th century stripped of its mahogany furniture and replaced with the raw, desperate energy of a dozen nations crammed into a single city block. For an immigrant arriving in 1850, the regular day begins in a room no larger than a modern walk-in closet. But you aren't alone. You share this space with your spouse, 4 children, and perhaps 2 boarders, strangers who pay a few cents to sleep on a pile of rags in the corner. The air is a thick, stagnant soup. Tenements were built back-to-back with no air shafts or ventilation. The windows, if there are any, look out onto a narrow alley filled with 3 stories of trash and the overflow from the communal privies. The morning commute for a tenement dweller isn't a walk to a factory. Often, the factory is your bedroom. This is the era of the sweatshop system. To save on overhead, manufacturers outsource work to families. Your kitchen table is a cigar rolling station or a garment assembly line. Your children, instead of going to school, spend 10 hours a day pulling basting threads or stripping tobacco leaves. Their small, nimble fingers are perfect for the work, and their meager earnings are the only thing keeping the rent collector from throwing your meager possessions onto the sidewalk. The sensory overload of the tenement is staggering. You don't hear your own thoughts. You hear the cacophony of 100 lives through paper-thin walls. You hear Yiddish, Irish, Italian, and German blending into a frantic urban roar. The smell is the tenement stink, a combination of boiled cabbage, unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of the slop buckets that sit in the hallway because the trek to the backyard privy is too dangerous at night. Midday in the slums is a battle for space. The streets are so crowded that the sunlight barely reaches the pavement. Pushcart vendors scream their prices for speckled or rotting fruit and day-old bread. Water is a precious commodity. You wait in a line 50 people deep at the single communal pump in the courtyard. The water is often milky or smells of sulfur, but it's all there is to wash the grease of the day's work from your skin.
In this environment, privacy is a concept for the rich. Life happens in the street. You see the news vendors, young boys sleeping on top of iron gratings to catch the warmth of the steam pipes below. You see the bucket brigades of women carrying coal up 5 flights of rickety, rotting wooden stairs. There is a constant low-level anxiety, the fear of fire. In these wooden tinderboxes, a single knocked-over candle can, and often does, incinerate an entire block in minutes. As evening falls, the tenement doesn't quiet down, it just changes its tune. The beer gardens and social clubs offer a brief respite. For an immigrant, these are the only places where the world makes sense, where you can speak your native tongue and hear music from a home you'll likely never see again. You spend your last few pennies on a glass of lager, not because you're a drunk, but because for 30 minutes you aren't a cabbie or a seamstress. You are a human being with a history. Returning to the room at night, you lie down on a straw mattress that rustles with the movement of lice and bedbugs. You're exhausted. Your lungs are heavy with coal dust, and your hands are cramped from the needle or the blade. But as you look at your children sleeping 3 to a bed, there is a grim 19th century hope. You aren't just surviving a regular day. You are the bridge. You are enduring the filth of 1850 so that your children might one day walk into the light of a different century.
While the city dwellers of the 1800s are suffocating in tenements, a different kind of regular day is unfolding thousands of miles to the west. For those who have loaded their lives into a covered wagon, the enemy isn't the factory boss or a lack of ventilation. It is the sheer, indifferent vastness of the American wilderness. Out here, the 19th century is stripped of its Victorian lace and reduced to its most primal elements: dirt, sweat, and the constant threat of the unknown. Your day on the frontier begins at 4 a.m., long before the sun dares to touch the prairie. There is no house to wake up in, only the canvas walls of a wagon or a soddy, a hut literally carved out of the earth and roofed with grass. When you wake up, the first thing you feel is the grit. The wind on the plains is relentless, blowing fine dust through every crack until it coats your teeth and settles in your coffee. You don't wash your face with water. Water is for the livestock. You wipe the sleep from your eyes with a dry cloth and step out into a silence so profound it makes your ears ring. The morning chores are a race against the heat. Before the sun becomes a hammer, the regular day demands the taming of the land. If you're a man, you're behind a plow pulled by oxen, animals that are as stubborn as the sun-baked soil. This isn't the soft garden dirt of the East. This is virgin sod, a thick mat of roots that hasn't been disturbed for 10,000 years. Every foot of progress is a physical battle that jars your bones and blisters your palms. There are no neighbors to help you, no stores to buy a replacement part if the plowshare snaps. You are the only mechanic, the only doctor, and the only law for 50 miles. For the woman on the frontier, the isolation is a psychological weight. Her day is spent in a kitchen that is often just a campfire. She cooks over buffalo chips, dried manure, because trees are a rare luxury on the Great Plains. The smell is pungent and earthy, a constant reminder of the raw reality of survival. She is the guardian of the family's health, using prairie medicine, poultices of mud for bee stings, or a terrifying concoction of kerosene and sugar for a child's croup. In the 1800s West, a simple broken leg or an infected tooth isn't just an inconvenience, it's a potential death sentence. Midday is a shimmering haze of heat. You eat your nooning meal in the sliver of shade provided by the wagon, usually hardtack, a tooth-breaking flour and water biscuit, and salt pork that has turned rancid in the sun. You don't complain. You swallow the salt and the dust because your body needs the fuel. The American dream in 1850 isn't about wealth, it's about making it to the next sunset without losing a mule or a child to the elements. The danger out here isn't just the climate, it's the lawlessness. The regular day includes the heavy weight of a Colt revolver or a Winchester rifle at your hip.
You're not looking for a gunfight like in the movies, you're terrified of it. Whether it's a desperate claim jumper, a pack of hungry wolves, or the terrifying realization that you're trespassing on land that indigenous tribes have fought for centuries, the tension is a permanent shadow. You scan the horizon constantly, not for beauty, but for signs, a dust cloud, a distant rider, or the ominous black wall of a fast-approaching supercell storm that could turn your world into a graveyard of hail and wind in minutes. As the sun sets, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and gold, the frontier night begins. There are no gas lamps here. The darkness is absolute, save for the flickering campfire. You sit with your back to the wagon, listening to the coyotes howl, a sound that feels like it's coming from the end of the world. You check your ammunition, you check your water barrels, and you check your family's faces. The 1800s on the frontier was a gamble with the highest stakes. It was a world of people who had turned their backs on the civilized filth of the East for the clean danger of the West. As you roll yourself into a buffalo robe and stare up at a sky filled with more stars than you ever thought possible, you realize the true cost of the century. The 1800s didn't just build cities, they broke the wilderness. And as you fall into a dreamless, exhausted sleep, you know that tomorrow you will wake up and push that horizon just 1 mile further.
If you think the factories were cramped or the frontier was lonely, you haven't yet stepped onto the deck of a 19th century merchant vessel or whaling ship. In the 1800s, the ocean was the world's highway, but the regular day for a sailor was a brutal cycle of wet wool, rotting food, and the constant threat of a watery grave. When you sign those ship's articles, you aren't just taking a job. You are surrendering your soul to the whim of the wind and the absolute tyranny of the captain. Your day begins at the change of the watch, often in the middle of a pitch-black night. There is no such thing as an 8-hour sleep. Life is lived in 4-hour increments. You are shaken awake in the forecastle, a damp, triangular room at the very front of the ship that reeks of bilge water, old tobacco, and the unwashed bodies of 20 men. The air is so thick you could cut it with a rigging knife. You scramble into your clothes, stiff, salt-crusted canvas trousers and a wool frock, and head up to the deck, where the spray of the Atlantic hits your face like 1,000 tiny needles. The work of a 19th century sailor is an aerial ballet performed in a hurricane. When the command, "all hands aloft," is barked, you don't hesitate. You climb the shrouds, the rope ladders that sway violently as the ship pitches. You find yourself 100 feet above the deck, balanced on a foot rope no thicker than your thumb, using both hands to haul in a wet, heavy sail that has the frozen consistency of sheet metal. If you fall, there is no safety net. The ship won't stop for you in a gale. You are simply a name to be crossed off the manifest. Midday brings the salt junk. This is the sailor's lunch, and it is a masterpiece of culinary horror. It is beef or pork that has been sitting in brine barrels for months, perhaps years. It is so hard it can be carved into buttons, and so salty it makes your throat feel like it's filled with sand. You eat it with hardtack, which by this point in the voyage is infested with weevils. Sailors have a grim ritual. They tap the biscuit on the table to let the bugs crawl out before taking a bite. To wash it down, you get a tot of grog, rum diluted with water and a splash of lime juice. You don't drink it for the buzz, you drink the lime to keep your teeth from falling out due to scurvy. The hierarchy at sea is more rigid than any royal court. The captain is a god. Beneath him, the mates are his disciples, often enforcing order with the cat of 9 tails. In the 1800s, flogging was the standard punishment for the slightest hesitation or insolence. The regular day is defined by a constant low-level fear of the lash. You work in silence,
punctuated only by the creaking of the timber and the shanty songs used to synchronize the men as they heave the heavy anchors. These songs aren't just for fun. They are the rhythmic heartbeat of the ship, the only thing keeping 20 men pulling in the same direction. As evening falls, if the seas are calm, the deck becomes a strange floating village. Men sit on coils of rope, mending their clothes, or practicing scrimshaw, the art of carving intricate designs into whale teeth or bone. They tell tall tales of sea serpents and ghost ships like the Flying Dutchman. These stories are an entertainment. In the 1800s, the line between myth and reality was very thin. When you are 1,000 miles from land in a wooden box, the supernatural feels very close. The night watch is the loneliest time in human history. You stand at the bow, staring into a blackness so total that the sky and the sea merge into one. There are no lighthouses out here, no GPS, only the stars and the dead reckoning of the navigator. You realize then that you are a speck of dust on a moving mountain of water. As you finally crawl back into your swaying hammock for your 4 hours of rest, your hands are tarred, stained black and cracked by salt and rope burns. You fall asleep to the sound of the hull groaning against the pressure of the deep. You are a sailor of the 1800s. You are the muscle that moves the world's trade, but to the world on land, you are a ghost, a man who lives between the horizon and the bottom of the sea.
The regular day we have walked through is not a static picture in a history book. It is a world in the middle of a violent, beautiful, and terrifying transformation. By the late 1850s, the very air you breathe begins to hum with the vibrations of change. The Industrial Revolution isn't just building factories, it is rewriting the human DNA of time itself. For thousands of years, humans lived by the sun and the seasons. In the 1800s, for the first time in history, humanity begins to live by the tick of the machine. As you stand on a street corner in the fading twilight of this era, you witness the birth of the standardized hour. Before this, every town had its own time based on the sun's position. If it was noon in New York, it might be 12:12 in Philadelphia. But the coming of the iron horse, the steam locomotive, changes everything. The train demands a schedule. Suddenly, your regular day is no longer measured by how much light is left in the sky, but by a rigid, unforgiving mechanical clock. The stress of being late is a new modern poison entering the human psyche. The skyline is also shifting. The steeples of churches, once the tallest points in any city, are being overtaken by the blackened chimneys of industry. Science is beginning to peel back the veil of the miasma. A few radical thinkers are starting to suggest that perhaps it isn't bad air killing the children, but tiny invisible organisms in the water. You see the first major civil engineering projects, massive brick sewers being laid beneath the mud, veins of a new civilization designed to carry away the filth that has defined your life. These are the cathedrals of the underworld, and they will save more lives than any doctor of the age. Communication is shattering the silence of the past. The telegraph, the Victorian internet, means that news of a war in Europe or a gold strike in California reaches your ears in hours rather than months. Your world is shrinking. The isolation of the 1800s is dying. You are no longer just a citizen of a town. You are becoming a node in a global network. The regular day is becoming faster, louder, and more connected. Even the way you see the night is changing. In the final years of the century, the flickering, stinking tallow candle is being replaced by the steady, humless glow of the incandescent bulb. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla are preparing to banish the shadows forever. The dangers of the night we explored will soon be pushed back by the flip of a switch, turning the 24-hour cycle into a playground for the modern world.
As you look back at the person you were at the start of this day, shivering under wool blankets, cracking ice in a wash basin, and dodging cholera in the streets, you realize you are looking at the last generation of ancient humans. The people of the 1800s were the bridge. They endured the maximum amount of physical hardship so that the foundations of the modern world could be poured. Their grit, their soot-stained hands, and their resilience are the silent ghosts haunting every skyscraper and smartphone of today. The day ends not with a conclusion, but with a transition. The sun sets on the horse and carriage, the whale oil lamp, and the hand-stitched life. When it rises again, it will shine on a world of steel, electricity, and the frantic, wonderful chaos of the 20th century. You have survived a day in the 1800s. You have felt the weight of its iron and the chill of its nights. And as you step out of the fog of history, you carry with you the realization that progress was paid for in the sweat and blood of those who lived this regular day.
The century didn't just change the world, it changed the human. If you could stand on a street corner in 1900 and look back at your regular day from 1850, you wouldn't just see different clothes or faster carriages. You would see a different psychology. The 1800s were the forge that hammered out the modern mind, and that process left deep, permanent scars on the people who survived it. As you start this final look at the era, you notice the physical toll. The 19th century was a hard world in a way we struggle to grasp. Look at the faces in the photographs from the late 1800s. Even the children look middle-aged. Their eyes have a 1,000-yard stare, born of witnessing things we now consider traumas: the death of siblings from simple fevers, the sight of public executions, and the relentless pressure of self-improvement. The Victorian era was obsessed with the idea that if you weren't constantly working or learning, you were rot. This created a generation of people who didn't know how to rest. The leisure we saw in the music halls was a desperate, loud reaction to the crushing silence of their daily toil. The environment itself had been fundamentally broken. The regular day was now lived in a world where the stars were obscured by a permanent ceiling of soot. The rivers, once pristine, were now chemical slurries. This was the trade-off. To have the cheap cotton shirt on your back and the iron stove in your kitchen, you had to sacrifice the air and the water. The 1800s were the first time humanity realized it could actually change the planet, for better and for worse. The miasma might have been a myth, but the pollution was very, very real. The concept of home had also been reinvented. In 1800, your home was likely where you worked, where you were born, and where you would die. By 1900, the regular day involved a commute. The home became a separate private sanctuary, a place to hide from the industrial world. This gave birth to our modern ideas of privacy and the nuclear family. You weren't part of a village anymore. You were an individual in a crowd. This brought a new kind of loneliness, the urban isolation of the 19th century city, where you could be surrounded by 1 million people and know none of them. And yet, despite the grit, the toxic medicine, and the brutal labor, there was a fierce pride in the regular day. The people of the 1800s knew they were building something. They saw the first bridges span impossible distances, the first wires carry thoughts across oceans, and the first machines replace the back-breaking work of 100 men. They lived in a constant state of future shock, but they didn't crumble under it. They adapted. They survived. As you step out of the 1800s and back into the present, take a look at your own day. The running water you used this morning, that's a 19th century dream. The light you flicked on, that was 19th century science. The clothes you wear, the clock you watch, and the city you walk through, they are all the children of that filthy, ambitious, and relentless century. You didn't just spend a day in the 1800s, you walked through the womb of the modern world. It wasn't a simpler time,
It was a more difficult, more dangerous, and more intense version of human existence. The regular day of the 1800s was a feat of daily heroism. And as you close this history, remember, we aren't just looking at the past. We are walking on the foundations they laid with their sweat, their soot, and their unstoppable will to move forward.
To truly understand the 1800s, we must look at the day through the eyes of those who had no choice but to grow up instantly. For a child in the mid to late 19th century, childhood was not a time of play or school. It was a time of economic necessity. If you were a child in an industrial city in 1860, your regular day began at 5 a.m., and it did not end until the gas lamps were being lit in the evening. You wake up on a thin pallet on the floor, your body aching from the 12 hours of standing you did yesterday. There is no milk, no soft bed, only the sound of your mother's voice telling you it's time to head to the mill. You are 6 years old, but in the eyes of the law and the factory owner, you are a helper. You walk through the gray morning light, joining a stream of other small shadows, thousands of children, some as young as 5, heading toward the brick giants that line the river. Inside the textile mill, the noise is the first thing that hits you. It is a physical force. Hundreds of power looms and spinning frames are clattering at once, a mechanical scream that makes conversation impossible. Your job is that of a piercer. You must watch the spinning threads, and when one breaks, your tiny, nimble fingers must dart into the moving machinery to tie the ends together. You don't stop the machine. That would lose money. You must be fast. If you are slow, the iron gears don't care. They will take a finger or a hand without slowing down. By noon, the air in the mill is thick with cotton lung, fine white dust that settles deep in your chest and makes you cough a dry, hacking sound that will stay with you for the rest of your short life. You don't get a lunch break in a dining room. You eat a piece of dry bread while standing at your station, your eyes never leaving the threads. The overlooker walks the aisles with a leather strop, ensuring that no child falls asleep or slows down. To him, you are cheaper than the oil used to grease the machines. If you aren't in the mills, you are in the coal mines. Here, the regular day is spent in total darkness. You are a trapper, sitting in a tiny, damp alcove for 12 hours straight, your only job being to open and close a ventilation door when the coal carts pass by. You sit in the pitch black, listening to the drip of water and the scurrying of rats, forbidden from having a candle because of the risk of methane explosions. You are a human ghost, buried alive for 6 days a week to ensure the city above has the coal it needs to stay warm. For the newsies on the street corner, the day is a different kind of struggle. You are an independent contractor at age 8. You buy your stack of papers with your own pennies, and if you don't sell them all, you don't eat. You develop a voice like gravel, screaming headlines about wars and scandals to businessmen who look right through you. You learn to sleep on warm sidewalk grates and to fight other boys for the best corners. You are savvy, cynical, and tough before you've even lost all your baby teeth. When the whistle finally blows at 7 p.m., you walk home in a daze of exhaustion. Your regular day has been a marathon of survival. You don't have toys, you don't know how to read, and your world is only as large as the factory floor or the coal seam. As you fall onto your pallet, your hands are black with soot or stained with machine oil. You don't dream of the future. You only hope that tomorrow the machine doesn't bite. The 1800s were built on the backs of these children. The wealth of the British Empire and the industrial might of the United States were forged by small hands in dark places. It wouldn't be until the very end of the century that society began to ask if a regular day for a child should involve a book instead of a loom. But for those who lived it,
The 1800s was a century where childhood was a luxury they simply couldn't afford.
In the 1800s, death was not something hidden away in sterile hospital wings. It was a permanent, visible member of the household. Because life was so fragile, the Victorians developed an elaborate, almost theatrical culture around the beautiful death. If you survived your regular day of labor and filth, your evening might be spent participating in a ritual of grief that would seem macabre to the modern mind, but for them it was the only way to make sense of the constant loss. When a family member died in the 1850s, the home transformed into a temple of mourning. You didn't call a funeral director to whisk the body away. You, the family, prepared the body. You washed it, dressed it in its finest clothes, and laid it out on the parlor table. To prevent the miasm of decay, you kept the windows open and placed heavy scented lilies around the room. The mirrors were draped in black crepe to prevent the soul from becoming trapped in the glass, and the clocks were stopped at the exact moment of death to signify that time for the beloved had ended. For a woman, the regular day after a death became a rigid performance of fashion and sorrow. Full mourning required her to wear solid black from head to toe, dresses of non-reflective silk crepe, heavy veils, and even black-bordered handkerchiefs for a full year and a day. To wear a hint of color too soon was a scandal that could ruin a reputation. Even her jewelry was funereal. The 1800s popularized memento mori jewelry, where the hair of the deceased was intricately woven into brooches, rings, or lockets. You wore the physical remains of your loved one against your skin every single day, a tangible bridge between the living and the dead. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the 1800s was post-mortem photography. Because photography was expensive and rare, a death was often the only time a family could afford a portrait. You would hire a photographer to come to the house and photograph the deceased, often propped up in a chair or lying on a sofa, sometimes with their eyes painted onto their closed lids to make them appear asleep, or even standing with the help of hidden iron braces. These shadow pictures were the only way to freeze a face in time before the inevitable rot of the grave took hold. Midday for the grieving family was often spent at the garden cemetery. Before the 1800s, the dead were crammed into overflowing churchyards in the city center, which poisoned the groundwater. The Victorians moved the dead to the outskirts, creating massive, beautiful parks like Greenwood in New York or Highgate in London. These weren't just graveyards, they were the first public parks. On a Sunday, you would pack a picnic, put on your black silk, and spend the afternoon eating lunch next to the elaborate marble monument of your grandmother. It was a day of leisure with the dead, a way to keep the family unit intact even across the veil. This obsession with death wasn't morbid for the sake of it, it was a survival mechanism. In a century where a quarter of all children died before their 5th birthday, and a simple fever could wipe out a father of 6 by nightfall, the Victorians needed to believe that death was a transition, not an end. They turned the regular day into a rehearsal for eternity. As the 1800s drew to a close, this heavy, black-veiled world began to lighten. The rise of modern medicine and the horrors of the coming Great War would eventually make such elaborate mourning feel impossible. But for the people of 1850, the beautiful death was the final act of a hard-lived life, a way to ensure that even in a world of soot, steam, and struggle, a person's exit was as grand and dignified as the century they had helped to build.
In the mid-1800s, there was a silent revolution happening in the shadows of the factories and the parlors. It wasn't fought with steam or iron, but with ink and paper. For the first time in human history, the regular day included the radical possibility of self-improvement. If you were a laborer in 1870, your body belonged to your employer, but your mind thanks to the explosion of the printing press, belonged to you. Your day doesn't end when you leave the workshop. Despite the 12 hours of physical toil, you don't head straight to bed. Instead, you walk toward the warm, glowing windows of the Mechanics Institute or the newly founded public library. These were the cathedrals of the working class. Inside, the air is quiet, smelling of old leather and cheap wood pulp paper. You see men with calloused hands and soot-stained collars hunched over books on engineering, political economy, or classical philosophy. In the 1800s, literacy was the ultimate weapon. If you could read, you could escape your station. The penny press is the heartbeat of this intellectual awakening. Before the 1830s, newspapers were expensive luxuries for the elite. But now, for a single cent, you can buy a broadsheet that connects you to the entire world. Your regular day includes a frantic consumption of information. You read about the latest scientific breakthroughs, like Darwin's theories that are shattering old certainties, or the dispatches from explorers trekking through the heart of Africa. The world is no longer a collection of isolated villages. It is a single unfolding story, and for 1 penny, you are a character in it. This was also the era of the Lyceum movement. Imagine finishing a grueling day of work and then walking 2 miles to a drafty hall to hear a lecture. You might see Ralph Waldo Emerson speaking on self-reliance, or a traveler showing magic lantern slides of the Egyptian pyramids. The thirst for knowledge was a physical ache. People didn't just want to survive, they wanted to understand. This created a unique 19th century phenomenon, the self-made man. It was the belief that through plain living and high thinking, a person could rise from the gutter to the boardroom. Even for the children, the day was changing. The ragged schools and the rise of compulsory education meant that the regular day was slowly being reclaimed from the factory. A child's hand that once held a threading bobbin now practiced Spencerian script on a slate. This wasn't just about learning ABCs, it was about discipline. The 1800s schoolroom was a stern place of rote memorization and the dunce cap, designed to produce orderly citizens for the industrial machine. But it also planted the seeds of curiosity that would eventually dismantle the very systems of child labor that built the schools. For women, the intellectual day was lived through the circulating library and the private journal. While social norms tried to keep her mind focused on domestic matters, the 1800s saw a massive rise in female authors and readers. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, between the baking and the mending, she would lose herself in the serialized novels of Charles Dickens or the Bronte sisters. These stories weren't just fiction, they were mirrors reflecting the injustices of the era and the secret desires for a life beyond the kitchen. As you finally blow out your candle at 11 p.m., your eyes are tired, but your world is larger. You have lived a day of the body, but also a day of the soul. The 1800s taught humanity that knowledge shouldn't be a locked treasure for the rich, but a public utility for all. You fall asleep knowing that while you may be a servant or a smith today, the book on your nightstand is a map to a different tomorrow.
To understand the 1800s, one must look at the opposite pole of the tenement and the factory. For the ultra-wealthy in the Gilded Age, the regular day was a different kind of marathon, a grueling, high-stakes performance of wealth, etiquette, and social warfare. If you are a debutante in a mansion on New York's Fifth Avenue in 1890, your life is not your own. It belongs to the 400, the elite social circle where one wrong word could result in permanent exile. Your day begins at 9 a.m., but you do not wake up in the way a laborer does. You are awoken by your lady's maid, who opens the heavy velvet curtains and brings you chocolate on a silver tray. You do not dress yourself. For the next hour, you are a passive mannequin as your maid lace-tightens your corset and layers you in silk and lace.
This is the first of 5 or 6 wardrobe changes you will endure today. In the 1800s, clothes were the primary language of power. A dress wasn't just fabric, it was a bill of sale for your family's fortune. The morning is dedicated to correspondence. You spend hours at a rosewood desk, writing thank you notes and invitations in perfect script. This isn't just chatting, it is the administrative work of the upper class. You are managing the family's social capital. Every calling card left in a silver tray in the foyer is a move on a chessboard. If you fail to return a visit within the prescribed 48 hours, you have declared a social war. Midday is for the promenade. You are driven in a polished carriage to Central Park or the local fashionable boulevard. You don't go there for exercise, you go to be seen. You sit perfectly upright, your gloved hands folded, nodding to the right people and ignoring the nouveau riche, those who have made their money in railroads or oil but don't have the old blood lineage. The air here is different. It's scented with expensive French perfume and the leather of the carriage seats, a sharp contrast to the stench of the slums just a few miles away. The afternoon tea is the most dangerous part of the day. In a drawing room filled with porcelain and ferns, the women of high society engage in the polite slaughter of reputations. Over cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey, the gossip flows. Who is losing their fortune? Whose husband was seen at the theater with a stage girl? In the 1800s, for a wealthy woman, your character was your only career. One scandal, one whisper of impropriety, and the invitations stop coming. Without invitations, you cease to exist in the eyes of the world. Evening is the climax, the grand ball. This is the 19th century version of a high-pressure corporate merger. You are laced into a gown that costs more than a factory worker makes in 10 years. The ballroom is a sea of gaslight, diamonds, and white ties. You dance the waltz, a dance once considered scandalous, but now the height of elegance, under the watchful eyes of the chaperones, the elderly matriarchs who guard the virtue of the young. Every smile, every dance partner, and every trip to the punch bowl is analyzed. You are not there to have fun. You are there to secure a marriage that will unite two great fortunes. As you finally return home at 3 a.m., exhausted from the weight of your jewelry and the strain of constant smiling, your maid unpins your hair. Your feet are swollen, and your ribs are bruised from the corset. You live in a world of unimaginable luxury, but you are as much a gear in the 19th century machine as the boy in the coal mine. You are the ornament of the era, the proof of its success, and the prisoner of its expectations. The sun will rise in a few hours, and the regular day of the elite will begin again, a cycle of dressing, visiting, and performing that leaves no room for the true self. By the late 1800s, the regular day for millions of people had become an unbearable pressure cooker. The soot, the 14-hour shifts, the lack of a vote, and the sight of Gilded Age mansions while children starved created a new kind of 19th century citizen, the revolutionary. This was the era when the silent masses finally found their voice, and the day-to-day life of the working class shifted from passive endurance to active defiance. Your day in 1892 might begin not with the chime of a clock, but with the secret passing of a handbill. You were a steel worker or a seamstress, and as you walk to work, a union organizer whispers to you in the shadows of the alley. He hands you a small, cheaply printed paper calling for a strike. In the 1800s, joining a union wasn't a matter of paperwork. It was an act of treason against the captains of industry. If the foreman sees that paper in your pocket, you aren't just fired, you are blacklisted, meaning no factory in the city will ever hire you again. The midday hours are no longer just about the grind. The air is thick with agitation. At the lunch whistle, instead of bolting your bread in silence, you gather in the back of the shop to listen to a soapbox orator. They speak of the 8-hour day. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. This sounds like a fairy tale to a generation that has worked from sunrise to sunset since they were children. You start to realize that the regular day isn't a law of nature. It's a choice made by men in suits, and it can be changed. For the women of the late 1800s, the rebellion is even more radical. Your day involves the suffrage movement. You might be a middle-class mother who, after finishing her domestic chores, puts on her Votes for Women sash and heads to a street corner. In 1890, a woman speaking in public is considered unnatural and hysterical. Men jeer at you, throwing rotten vegetables or stones. You aren't just fighting for a ballot, you are fighting for the right to be recognized as a legal person rather than the property of your husband or father. The regular day often turns violent. This is the era of the great strikes, the Homestead strike, the Pullman strike, the Haymarket affair. If you walk out of your factory in protest, you aren't met with a negotiator, you are met with the Pinkertons, private mercenaries hired by the owners to break your spirit. You see your neighbors beaten with clubs and the militia called in with Gatling guns. The 1800s didn't give away rights for free. Every minute of the weekend we enjoy today was paid for with the blood of people in 1890 who decided they had finally had enough. Evening meetings are held in secret basements or crowded Turner halls. By the light of a few lanterns, you debate the works of Karl Marx, Susan Anthony, or Frederick Douglass. The fatigue in your muscles is replaced by a strange electric hope. You are part of something bigger than your own survival. You are part of a movement. For the first time, the regular day feels like a countdown to a new world. As you head home, the city feels different. The gas lamps seem to flicker with a new energy. You know that tomorrow you might be arrested, you might be beaten, or you might lose everything. But as you lie down, you realize that the 1800s have done the impossible. They have taught the cogs in the machine that they have the power to stop the wheels. The 19th century began with the absolute power of kings and coal lords. It is ending with the roar of the people. The regular day will never be the same again.
As we stand at the threshold where the 1800s bleed into the 1900s, it's time to look back at the regular day one last time. We have walked through the freezing dawns, smelled the acrid smoke of the factories, felt the sting of the salt spray, and heard the defiant roar of the protesters. But as the fog of history settles over the 19th century, we are left with a haunting question. What did it actually feel like to be a human in a world that was changing faster than the heart could follow? The 1800s was the century of the Great Acceleration. At its birth, a man moved no faster than a horse could gallop. By its end, he could outrun the wind on a locomotive and send his voice across the Atlantic in a heartbeat. But this progress came at a psychological cost. For the first time, humans felt out of sync with nature. The 19th century invented the hustle. It turned time into a commodity to be bought, sold, and squeezed for every drop of profit. We gained the light bulb, but we lost the stars. We gained the medicine, but we lost the slow, rhythmic peace of the pre-industrial world. If you were to meet your 1850s self today, the first thing that would shock you wouldn't be the technology, it would be the resilience. The regular day of the 1800s required a level of physical and mental toughness that has largely withered in our age of convenience. They lived in a world where nothing was disposable. Everything, from a wool coat to a piece of scrap iron, was mended, repurposed, and cherished. They understood the value of things because they knew the exact amount of sweat required to produce them. Yet we must not romanticize the grit. The 1800s was a century of profound cruelty.
It was the era that perfected the science of racism, that saw the genocide of indigenous peoples in the name of manifest destiny, and that treated the poor as a different, lesser species. The regular day for millions was a tragedy written in soot and blood. The progress we celebrate was built on a foundation of systemic inequality that we are still, over 100 years later, trying to dismantle. As you look around your modern room, realize that you are surrounded by the ghosts of the 1800s. Your concept of a job, your 9-to-5 schedule, your weekend, your school system, and even your idea of romantic love were all polished and popularized in the 19th century. We are the children of the Victorians, living in the house they built, even if we've repainted the walls and upgraded the plumbing. The 1800s taught us that humanity is capable of terrifying destruction and breathtaking creation. It showed us that a single person, armed with a book and a dream, can change the course of history, but also that a system, once set in motion, can crush the individual without a second thought. It was a century of paradoxes, the most religious age and the age of Darwin, the age of slavery and the age of abolition, the age of the machine and the age of the soul. The factory whistle has been blown the last time. The gas lamps are being extinguished one by one. The horse-drawn carriage has disappeared around the corner, replaced by the distant hum of a world that will never be quiet again. You have survived the 1800s. You have witnessed the birth of the modern world. As you step back into the 21st century, carry with you the memory of the regular day. Let it remind you that every luxury you possess was once a miracle, and every right you enjoy was once a battle. The 1800s is gone, but its heartbeat, that restless, striving, soot-stained pulse, lives on in you.
As the 1800s reached their final decade, the regular day wasn't just being challenged by physical strikes or political marches. It was being shaken by a revolution of the internal world. For centuries, humans had looked outward to survive the elements. Now, for the first time, they began to look inward. The late 19th century was the era when humanity discovered that the most dangerous and mysterious frontier wasn't the American West or the deep sea, it was the human mind. Your evening in 1895 might include a visit to a séance. Because death was such a constant companion, as we saw in the rituals of mourning, the Victorians became obsessed with spiritualism. You sit in a darkened parlor, holding hands with strangers, waiting for a medium to produce ectoplasm or for a table to tilt. This wasn't just a parlor trick. It was a desperate attempt to use the new sciences of electricity and magnetism to talk to the dead. In a world of telegraphs that sent invisible messages through wires, people wondered, why couldn't the soul send a message through the veil? Simultaneously, a doctor in Vienna named Sigmund Freud was beginning to suggest that your regular day was being governed by a subconscious, a dark, hidden basement of the mind filled with desires and traumas you didn't even know you had. This was a terrifying thought for the Victorians, who valued self-control and character above all else. Suddenly, the stiff upper lip was no longer enough. The 1800s were ending with the realization that we are strangers even to ourselves. This internal awakening changed the way people spent their regular idle time. The 19th century gave birth to the modern hobby. Because the machine had taken over some of the labor, the middle class found themselves with a terrifying new commodity: boredom. To combat it, they turned to taxidermy, botanizing, collecting and pressing plants, and the obsessive collection of stamps or coins. These weren't just pastimes, they were attempts to categorize and control a world that felt like it was spinning out of control.
The regular day was also the era of the Great Fake. This was the age of P.T. Barnum, where people flocked to see mermaids, a monkey's head sewn onto a fishtail, and giants. The 1800s mind was uniquely poised between ancient superstition and modern science. They were willing to believe almost anything if it was presented with enough scientific jargon. This was the birth of the consumer of information, the ancestor of the modern internet user, sifting through a world of fake news and wonders. As you look at the person from 1899, you see someone who is tired, not just in their muscles, but in their spirit. They have lived through the death of God, as Nietzsche claimed, and the birth of the machine. They have seen the earth mapped, the atom theorized, and the soul photographed. They are modern because they are anxious. They are the first generation to feel that the world is too loud, too fast, and too complicated. The sun sets on Chapter 20. The 1800s are no longer a place of simplicity or old-fashioned values. They are a frantic, neurotic, brilliant, and messy laboratory of the human experience. As you blow out your lamp, the shadows on the wall seem to flicker with the ghosts of 1,000 regular days that built the very reality you are standing in right now.